The Concord stagecoach lurched violently to the left, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against a ridge of hardened mud that the sun had baked into stone. Inside the cramped cabin, the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the permeating dust of the Kansas Territory. It was the summer of 1882, and the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the roof of the coach and seeping through the leather curtains. Abigail Cole sat squeezed into the corner of the rear bench, her spine rigid against the horsehair padding. She did not lean back. To lean back was to admit exhaustion, and Abby knew that if she let herself feel how tired she truly was, she might shatter right there in front of strangers. Instead, she kept her arm wrapped tight around her daughter, Maggie. The child was small for 6 years old, her pale hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She slept fitfully, her head heavy against Abby's rib cage, jerking awake every time the coach hit a rut deep enough to rattle their teeth. "Are we there yet, Mama?" Maggie whispered, her voice dry and thin. "Soon, baby, soon," Abby murmured, smoothing the girl's hair with a gloved hand that she tried to keep steady. Across from her sat a heavy-set man in a bowler hat who dealt in farm implements, and next to him, a severe woman with a Bible resting on her knees like a weapon. For the last 50 miles, the woman's eyes had flickered repeatedly to Abby's left hand. There was no gold band there. There was only a faint tan line where one might have been, or perhaps where one never was. The woman would look at the hand, then look at the child, and then press her lips together until they were white lines of disapproval. Abby stared out the window at the passing landscape. It was a brutal, beautiful emptiness. The prairie stretched out in endless undulations of brown and gold, broken only by the occasional twist of a mesquite bush or the shadow of a hawk circling in the blinding blue sky. It looked nothing like the green, rolling hills of Ohio she had left behind. This land looked like it didn't care if you lived or died. It just existed, vast and silent. The driver's voice cracked like a whip from the box above. "Red Rock Crossing, coming up on the rise?" The passengers stirred. The implement dealer pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and mopped his red face. "About time," he grunted. "My spine feels like it has been put through a thresher." The coach crested a low hill, and the town revealed itself. It was not the bustling settlement Abby had pictured when she read her cousin's letter 3 months ago. It was a scar on the earth. A single main street, churned into deep ruts, ran between 2 rows of false-fronted wooden buildings that looked as if they were leaning away from the wind. There was a livery stable, a general store, a hotel that had seen better days, and at the far end, the white-clapboard steeple of a church, pointing an accusing finger at the heavens. As the horses slowed, their hooves thudding heavily on the packed dirt, the town seemed to wake up. Men drifted out of the shadows of the saloon porch. A blacksmith paused, his hammer resting on the anvil. They watched the arrival of the stage not with excitement, but with a guarded, predatory curiosity. Who is getting off? Who brings money? Who brings trouble? The coach rocked to a halt in front of the station office. Dust billowed up in a choking cloud, coating everything in a fine gray powder. The door swung open, and the heat of the afternoon rushed in to meet them. Abby waited for the other passengers to exit. She wanted to gather her courage before she faced the town. When the cabin was empty, she took a deep breath, adjusted her bonnet, and nudged Maggie gently. "Come on, sweet girl." "We are here." They stepped down into the blinding sunlight. The ground felt unsteady beneath Abby's boots after days of rocking motion. She gripped Maggie's hand tightly. The air here smelled different, sharper. It smelled of sagebrush, dry rot, horse sweat, and the underlying scent of cattle. A group of cowboys leaned against the hitching rail of the saloon across the street. They were rough men, covered in the dust of the trail, their hats pulled low. As Abby stepped onto the boardwalk, their conversation died away. She felt their eyes crawling over her, taking in the cut of her dress, which was decent but frayed at the hem, the weary slump of her shoulders, and the child clinging to her skirt. She kept her chin high, refusing to meet their gaze. She turned to the driver, who was tossing luggage down from the roof. "That is mine," she said, pointing to a battered leather trunk reinforced with iron bands, "and the carpet bag." The driver grunted and dropped the heavy trunk into the dirt with a thud that made Abby wince. It contained everything she owned in the world: her winter quilt, her few books, Maggie's baby clothes, and the locket she could not bring herself to sell. She looked around for a porter or a station agent, but there was no one. The implement dealer had already marched off toward the hotel, and the Bible woman was being greeted by a local family. Abby was alone. She adjusted her grip on the carpet bag and looked down at Maggie. "You hold on to my skirt. Maggie, do not let go." Abby bent and gripped the leather handle of the trunk. She pulled, but the heavy box barely moved, carving a shallow groove in the dirt. She was not a weak woman. She had scrubbed floors and carried water buckets since she was 12. But the journey had sapped her strength, and the heat was making her head spin. She tugged again, straining, her face flushing with exertion. Across the street, one of the cowboys laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Need a mule for that one." Someone called out. Abby bit her lip and pulled again. She would not ask them for help. She would die on this street before she asked them for help. From the shadows of the livery stable adjacent to the station, a figure emerged. He moved differently than the men on the porch. He did not saunter, and he did not strut. He walked with a quiet, efficient economy of motion, like a predator conserving energy. Caleb Ward had been unsaddling a roan gelding when the stage arrived. He had watched the woman step down, saw the way she positioned her body between the town and the child. He had seen the men laughing. He wiped his hands on a rag. Stepping out into the sunlight, he was a tall man, lean as a whipcord, with wide shoulders that pulled at the fabric of his faded blue shirt. A sweat stain darkened the center of his back. He wore a low-slung gun belt, the leather worn smooth, and the handle of the Colt revolver looked like it was an extension of his hand. But it was his face that made people look twice, and then look away. A jagged, pale scar ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing into the dark stubble of his jaw. It was an old wound, but it gave his face a permanent expression of severity. He walked past the jeering cowboys without acknowledging them. He crossed the street, the spurs on his boots chiming softly in the silence. He stopped beside Abby. She froze, looking up at him. Up close, he was intimidating, smelling of hard work and horses. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but she saw they were a startling, clear gray, like storm clouds before rain. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was essentially gravel, low and rough, as if he didn't use it often. Abby tightened her grip on the trunk handle. "I can manage. Thank you." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't smile. He simply stepped in, brushing her hand aside gently but firmly. He bent his knees, gripped the trunk with one hand, and swung it up onto his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. The trunk must have weighed 80 pounds, but he handled it like it was a sack of feathers. "Where to?" he asked. Abby blinked, startled by the suddenness of his intervention. "The boarding house, the one run by Mrs. Briggs." Caleb nodded once. He turned and began walking down the boardwalk. The heavy trunk balanced easily. Abby grabbed Maggie's hand and hurried to catch up. "Thank you," she said, breathless. "That was very kind of you." Caleb kept walking, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "It is not far." Maggie, who had been hiding behind Abby's skirts, peeked out. She stared at the man's spurs, entranced by the little rowels that spun with every step. She looked up at the massive trunk on his shoulder, then at the scar on his face. "Are you a cowboy?" Maggie asked, her voice piping up in the silence. Abby hushed her. "Maggie, hush now." Caleb glanced down. The corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I reckon so, little one." They reached a 2-story clapboard house painted a peeling yellow. A sign hung over the porch: Red Rock Boarding House, H. Briggs, Proprietor. Caleb walked up the steps and set the trunk down by the front door with surprising gentleness. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, wait," Abby said, fumbling with the clasp of her reticule. I should pay you for your trouble." Caleb took a step back, shaking his head. Keep your money. You will need it here. He turned and walked away, his boots thudding on the wooden planks, heading back toward the livery without looking back. Abby watched him go, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. It wasn't attraction, exactly. It was the shock of being treated with dignity. "Come on, Maggie," she said, smoothing her dress. "Let us see if we have a bed." The interior of the boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and lemon oil. Mrs. Hattie Briggs was a woman made of sharp angles and gray wool. She stood behind a reception desk, looking Abby up and down with eyes that missed nothing. She saw the dusty dress, the weary child, and the lack of a husband. "I do not run a charity house," Mrs. Briggs said, her voice like dry leaves. "I can pay," Abby said quickly, placing $3 silver on the counter. It was a terrifying amount, nearly half of what she had left. "I need a room, just for me and my daughter." Mrs. Briggs eyed the coins, then scooped them into a drawer. "I have the attic room. It is small, and it gets hot in the summer and cold in the winter. No cooking in the room. No gentlemen callers." Abby felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "There will be no callers." Mrs. Briggs leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "See that there are not. Red Rock is a small town. Mrs. Cole. People talk. A woman with baggage like you. Well, you will find that forgiveness is in short supply out here." Abby understood perfectly. Baggage meant Maggie. Baggage meant sin. "I am here to work, Mrs. Briggs. That is all." Mrs. Briggs sniffed and handed her a heavy iron key. "Top of the stairs. Breakfast is at 6 sharp. If you are late, you do not eat." The room was exactly as promised. An oven. The roof slanted sharply on both sides, leaving only a narrow strip of floor where one could stand upright. There was a single iron bed with a lumpy mattress, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, and a small window that looked out over the alley in the back of the saloon. Abby sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning in protest. She pulled Maggie onto her lap. The child was already half asleep. "Is this home now?" Maggie mumbled. "For a little while," Abby whispered, kissing the damp hair at her temple. "Just for a little while." That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a violent shade of bruised purple. The heat did not leave. It simply settled into the dust. At the Lucky Horseshoe Saloon, the lamps were lit, casting a yellow, smoky glow over the bar. The room was loud with the clatter of poker chips and the murmur of men unwinding after days on the range. Caleb stood at the far end of the bar, nursing a warm beer. He preferred to stand with his back to the wall, watching the room. It was an old habit, one he couldn't break. He listened to the hum of conversation, letting it wash over him without participating. At a round table near the center of the room sat Victor Hale. Victor owned the general store, the largest share of the livery, and a sprawling ranch north of town. He was a man who wore his wealth in the shine of his boots and the heavy gold watch chain draped across his vest. His hair was slicked back with sweet-smelling oil that struggled to mask the scent of his ambition. "Did you see her?" Victor was saying loudly. "Holding court with 3 other men, the new arrival? Pretty little thing, under all that road dust." A cowboy named Shorty laughed. "I saw her. Looked like a stiff wind would blow her over. And she has a kid. That is the best part," Victor said, leaning back and swirling his whiskey. "A woman arrives alone with a brat? That tells you everything you need to know. She is damaged goods." The men chuckled. "I give it a month," Victor continued, his eyes glittering. "Maybe less. She will run out of money. The widow Briggs will kick her out. And then," he gestured toward the stairs leading to the rooms above the saloon, "where the working girls stayed, she will be looking for a protector. I do not know." "Victor," Shorty said. She looked proud. Did not even want help with her trunk until Scarface over there stepped in. Victor glanced toward the end of the bar. Caleb met his gaze steadily, his face impassive. "Ward has a soft spot for strays," Victor sneered. "Always picking up broken things. But mark my words, No respectable man wants a woman who is already carrying another man's mistake. She is ripe for the picking. Boys, just you wait. Caleb's hand tightened around his glass. The glass was thick, but for a second, he thought it might shatter. A familiar, dark heat uncurled in his belly, the old rage, the violence he had spent 5 years trying to bury under hard work and silence. He imagined walking over to the table. He imagined the sound Victor's jaw would make if he connected with it. It would be easy. Too easy. And it would solve nothing. He was just a ranch hand with a bloody past. Victor Hale was the town patriarch. Caleb drained his beer in one long swallow, slammed the glass down on the wood, and turned on his heel. He walked out of the swinging doors into the night air, leaving the laughter behind him. But the words stuck in his mind like burrs, damaged goods. The next morning, Red Rock Crossing seemed even harsher in the daylight. The sun was a white disk burning a hole in the sky. Abby dressed Maggie in her cleanest pinafore and brushed her own hair until it shone, twisting it into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. She needed to look capable. She needed to look respectable. They walked down the main street, the boardwalk creaking under their feet. Abby's first stop was the general store. Victor Hale stood behind the counter, measuring out coffee beans. When Abby entered, the bell above the door jingled, and his eyes snapped to her. A slow, appreciative smile spread across his face that made Abby's skin crawl. "Good morning, ma'am. Or is it Miss? Mrs. Cole." Abby lied smoothly. She had learned long ago that the title was a shield. However flimsy, Mrs. Cole, Victor repeated, savoring the word as if he knew it was false. "What can I do for you?" "I am looking for employment." "Mr. Hale, I can keep books, I can stock shelves, and I am very good with customers." Victor leaned over the counter. His eyes dropped to her bodice, then flicked over to Maggie, who was examining a jar of peppermint sticks. "Well now, I usually hire men for the heavy work, and my wife, well, she handles the lighter side of things." A woman emerged from the back room. She was thin and sharp-featured, wearing a dress of expensive silk that looked out of place in the dusty store. She looked at Abby, then at Victor's leaning posture, and her expression hardened into granite. "We are not hiring," the woman said, her voice ice-cold. "But," Abby started, "we have no need of help. Mrs. Cole," the woman interrupted, "especially not the kind that brings a child to a place of business. Good day." Abby stiffened. She took Maggie's hand. "Good day," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. She tried the hotel next. The manager, a harried man with ink-stained fingers, barely looked up from his ledger. No maids needed. Full up. She tried the laundry. The Chinese proprietor looked at her hands, pale, soft, unscarred, and shook his head kindly. "Too hard for you, missus. You burn hands. Finally, she went to the church. She found the matron, Mrs. Gable, arranging flowers on the altar. Mrs. Gable was the woman from the stagecoach, the one with the Bible. When she saw Abby, she didn't even pretend to smile. 'I am willing to do anything,' Abby said, desperation creeping into her voice. 'Scrubbing, mending, cooking. I need to feed my daughter. Mrs. Gable adjusted a lily, snapping its stem with a sharp click. "There is a family out near the creek, the Millers. They are looking for a wet nurse, but they would require you to live in—" "I could do that," Abby said, hope flaring. "But they have no room for 2 children, Mrs. Gable said pointedly. "If you were to place your daughter elsewhere, perhaps the orphanage in Denver has room, then you might find a respectable position. It would be better for the child, do you not think, to be raised in a stable environment?" The air in the church suddenly felt very thin. Abby stared at the woman's back. "Leave her?" Abby whispered. "You must be practical." "Mrs. Gable said, turning around. "A woman in your situation cannot expect to have it all. You made your choices. Now you must pay the price for them." Abby felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a fierce, protective fire. "My daughter is not a price to be paid," Abby said, her voice shaking but loud in the quiet sanctuary. "She is a child, and I would scrub out pigsties with my bare hands before I let strangers raise her." She turned and marched out of the church, dragging a confused Maggie behind her. They were halfway down Main Street when the wind changed. It happened in an instant. The hot breeze that had been blowing from the south suddenly died. The air went still, heavy and electric. Then, the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. "Mama?" Maggie tugged at her hand. "Look!" Abby looked north. The horizon had disappeared. A wall of darkness was rushing toward them, stretching from the ground to the heavens. It wasn't rain. It was a rolling, boiling mountain of brown earth. "Dust storm!" someone shouted. "Get inside." Shopkeepers ran to slam shutters closed. Horses at the hitching rails screamed and pulled at their tethers. Abby grabbed Maggie and ran. She aimed for the boarding house, but it was 2 blocks away. The wall of dust hit them before they had taken 10 steps. It was like being struck by a solid object. The wind roared like a freight train, ripping the bonnet from Abby's head. The air turned instantly into a grit-filled scouring pad. It filled her nose, her mouth, her eyes. Maggie screamed, a sound that was instantly swallowed by the wind. Abby dropped to her knees, pulling Maggie into her chest, wrapping her coat over the girl's head. She couldn't see 2 feet in front of her. The world was nothing but brown chaos and stinging pain. She tried to stand, to find a wall, a door, anything, but the wind shoved her back down. She was disoriented, blind, and terrified. Then, a hand gripped her arm. It was a strong, calloused grip. She looked up and saw a shape looming out of the brown, swirling haze. A man, a bandana tied over his nose and mouth, his hat pulled low. He didn't speak. He couldn't have been heard anyway. He hauled Abby to her feet, keeping one arm around her waist to anchor her against the wind. He reached down and scooped Maggie up with his other arm, holding her head against his shoulder. He pulled them forward, moving with certainty through the blindness. They stumbled a few yards, turned a corner, and then he was fumbling with a latch. A heavy wooden door groaned open. He shoved them inside and threw his weight against the door to close it. The latch clicked, and the roar of the wind was instantly muffled to a dull, vibrating thrum. They were in the livery barn. The air was thick with hay dust, but it was still. Horses shifted nervously in their stalls, whickering in the dark. The man lowered Maggie to the ground and pulled down his bandana. It was Caleb. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked at Abby, who was trembling violently, her hair wild, her face pale beneath the layer of dust. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice cutting through her panic. Abby shook her head, coughing. No, thank you. We were caught. I did not see it coming. It happens fast out here," Caleb said. He unhooked a canteen from a peg on the wall and uncorked it. "Here, wash the grit out." Abby took the canteen, her hands shaking so hard the water sloshed over the rim. She tried to lift it to her lips, but her teeth were chattering. Caleb watched her for a second, then reached out and steadied the canteen with his own large hand, guiding it to her mouth. His fingers were warm and rough against her skin. "Drink slow," he murmured. She took a swallow. The water was lukewarm and tasted of tin, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She handed it to Maggie, who drank greedily. Caleb took the canteen back and took a swig himself. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You cannot be out walking when the sky turns that color. Ma'am, this land will kill you if you do not watch it." "I know," Abby said, wrapping her arms around herself. She felt small and foolish. Everyone had warned her, and she hadn't listened. She looked around the barn. It was shadowy and large, filled with the comforting, earthy smells of animals. It felt safe in a way the town outside did not. Caleb pulled a crate over. "Sit down. We have to wait it out. Could be an hour. Could be all night." Abby sat, pulling Maggie onto her lap. Caleb leaned against a support beam, watching the door rattle in its frame. "Why did you help us?" Abby asked softly. "You do not even know us." Caleb looked at her. The shadows softened the harsh line of his scar. "I know what it feels like to be caught in the open," he said simply, with no cover. He didn't elaborate, but Abby heard the weight in his words. She looked at his hands. Hands that could lift a heavy trunk or guide a terrified woman. Hands that rested near a gun. "Thank you, Caleb," she said. He tipped his hat brim down, hiding his eyes. "Do not mention it." The storm raged for 3 hours. When it finally died, the silence that followed was ringing and absolute. Abby and Maggie made it back to the boarding house under a purple twilight sky. The town was covered in a fresh inch of brown silt. That night, the attic room was stiflingly hot. Maggie was finally asleep, her breathing raspy from the dust. Abby sat by the small window, a single candle burning low on the washstand. She emptied her purse onto the quilt. $7.40. That was it. That was everything standing between them and starvation. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter from her cousin. Samuel. It was creased and worn from 100 readings. Red Rock is growing. Abby. There is work here for those willing. A new start. Nobody asks questions west of the Mississippi. Samuel was gone by the time she arrived. Moved on to California. The station master had said there was no job, there was no welcome, just the wind and the stairs. Abby blew out the candle to save the wax. She sat in the dark, listening to the vast silence of the plains outside. She remembered the day she left home, her father's face, purple with rage. "You have shamed us. You have ruined yourself." She remembered the boy, no, the man, who had whispered promises in the hayloft and then vanished the moment her belly began to swell. They all thought she was weak. They all thought she would crawl back and beg for forgiveness, or give Maggie away to hide her sin. Abby looked at the sleeping shape of her daughter. She reached out and touched Maggie's cheek. "I will not let them win. Maggie," she whispered into the dark, "I will scrub floors until my fingers bleed. I will starve before I let them take you." Outside, far out on the black prairie, a coyote howled, a lonely, jagged sound that rose up to the indifference of the stars. It was answered by another, and then another, a chorus of wild hunger. Abby lay down on the lumpy mattress and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. She closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She listened to the coyotes, and she thought of the scarred man in the barn who had offered her water when the whole world wanted her to choke on dust. The week that followed their arrival in Red Rock Crossing was a lesson in the architecture of humiliation. Abby learned that poverty in the West was not merely a lack of coin, it was a physical weight, pressing down on the spine until one either broke or calcified. To pay the reduced rent, Mrs. Briggs demanded. Abby became a ghost in the boarding house hallways before the sun even crested the horizon. She spent her mornings on her knees, a bucket of gray water beside her, scrubbing pine floorboards that seemed to drink dirt and sweat in equal measure. The lye soap was harsh, a caustic brick that stripped the oils from her skin. Within 3 days, her knuckles were raw and red. Within 5, deep fissures had opened in the webs of her fingers, stinging sharply every time she plunged her hands back into the water. She washed linens in a copper tub out back, stirring the heavy, sodden sheets with a wooden paddle until her shoulders burned with a fire that did not dim until sleep took her. Mrs. Briggs watched her with the unblinking gaze of a hawk circling a field mouse. "You missed a spot in the corner of the parlor, Mrs." Briggs said on Tuesday, pointing a bony finger. Abby did not argue. She simply went back, knelt, and scrubbed until the wood bleached white. On Thursday, Mrs. Briggs cornered her in the pantry. "I saw a man look up at the window when you were shaking out the rugs," Hattie said, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial hiss. He was looking at the dust. "Mrs. Briggs," Abby replied, clutching a basket of dried apples. "Do not be coy with me," the widow snapped. "A woman in your position is like honey to flies. You invite trouble just by breathing. I run a respectable house. Mrs. Cole, if I see you encouraging any of these drifters, or if I hear whispers that you are entertaining guests, you and that child will be on the street before you can blink." Abby swallowed the retort that rose in her throat. She wanted to scream that she had done nothing but work, that she wore high collars and kept her eyes on the ground, that she was not the one chasing men. But she thought of Maggie sleeping upstairs, warm and safe for the first time in weeks. "I understand," Abby said quietly. "There will be no trouble." She swallowed her pride. It tasted like bile, bitter and hot. But she swallowed it all the same. She was a mother first and a woman with dignity second. While Abby fought her battles with lie and judgment, Caleb Ward fought the land itself. The Bar T Ranch lay 10 miles north of town, a sprawling empire of scrub brush, rock, and hard-packed earth that stretched out toward the distant mesas like a tanned hide drying in the sun. Caleb rode out before dawn, the sky a bruised purple that slowly bled into a blinding, relentless blue. His days were measured in the ache of his muscles and the height of the sun. The work was brutal and unending. There were calves to be branded, the smell of burning hair and terrified animals filling the corral. There were miles of wire fence to check, dragging heavy spools through the sagebrush to patch breaks made by restless herds or wandering buffalo. Caleb preferred the fence line. It took him far away from the bunkhouse, away from the other hands who played cards and swapped stories about women they had known in Abilene or Dodge. Caleb had no stories he wanted to share. He rode a sturdy bay gelding named Whiskey, a horse with a hard mouth and an endless reserve of stamina. As they traversed the yellow-brown waves of the prairie, the solitude usually soothed him, but lately, the silence felt crowded. Memories he had kept locked away for 5 years were beginning to rattle the bars of his mind. The heat shimmering off the rocks reminded him of the fires in the border counties, back when he rode with a company of men who called themselves regulators but acted like wolves. He remembered the skirmishes along the Rio Grande, the sharp crack of repeating rifles, the confusion of dust and blood. He remembered the faces of the men he had killed. They did not haunt him because they were innocent. Most had been killers themselves. They haunted him because killing them had been so easy. It was the night the farm burned, the night the boy died, that truly stayed with him. He could still hear the mother screaming. It was a sound that cut through the years, as sharp today as it was then. Caleb pulled his hat lower, squinting against the glare. He was 32 years old, but his soul felt ancient. He believed, with the certainty of a man who knows the weight of his own sins, that he was broken beyond repair. He was a tool to be used for hard labor and violence. Nothing more. A home, a wife, a child. Those were things for whole men, not for men with scars on their faces and blood on their hands. Yet, as he hammered a staple into a cedar post, the image of a woman with defiant eyes and a small girl clutching her skirt pushed its way into his thoughts. He struck the staple again, harder than necessary, driving it deep into the wood. It was a Sunday afternoon when the walls between their worlds began to thin. Caleb had ridden into town to fix a wagon wheel for the livery stable owner, a favor he did on his days off for a little extra coin. The livery yard backed up against the rear lot of the boarding house, separated only by a flimsy rail fence. He had tied his own horse, the gentle gray mare he called Smoke, to the rail while he worked on the wagon. He was deep in concentration, greasing the axle, when he heard a soft voice. "Hello, horse." Caleb froze, then turned slowly. Maggie was standing on the other side of the fence. She had climbed up onto the bottom rail, her small hands gripping the wood, her face pressed near the mare's nose. She was wearing a faded blue dress that had been mended at the elbow. "You possess very big eyes," Maggie whispered to the mare. The horse blew out a breath, fluttering its nostrils, and Maggie giggled, shrinking back but not leaving. "Maggie!" The shout came from the back door of the boarding house. Abby came running out, wiping suds from her hands onto her apron. Her face was pale with panic. She saw the large animal, the small child, and the cowboy nearby, and terror seized her. "Get away from there!" Abby cried, rushing forward and grabbing Maggie by the waist to pull her down. "That animal could bite you." Maggie started to cry, startled by her mother's fear. "I just wanted to touch her nose. Mama!" Caleb stood up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He saw the genuine terror in Abby's eyes, not just concern, but a deep-seated fear that the world was waiting to hurt her child at every turn. "She is safe, ma'am," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "Smoke is gentle as a lamb." Abby looked up, breathless, clutching Maggie to her hip. She saw Caleb, the man who had carried her trunk. The panic in her chest eased slightly, replaced by embarrassment. I am sorry," Abby stammered. She wanders off. Caleb walked over to the fence. He moved slowly, telegraphing his harmlessness. He looked at Maggie, whose face was buried in Abby's neck. "She likes the smell of peppermint," Caleb said to the top of Maggie's head. "If you have a peppermint, she will follow you to the moon." Maggie turned one tear-filled eye toward him. "I do not have a peppermint." Caleb reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped hard candy. He held it out. "Well, today is your lucky day." Abby hesitated. She knew she should take the child and go inside. Mrs. Briggs would be watching, but Maggie's eyes were so wide, and the cowboy looked so lonely. "You can take it." "Maggie," Abby whispered. Maggie reached out a small hand and took the candy. "Thank you." "Do you want to pet her properly?" Caleb asked. Maggie looked at her mother. Abby nodded slowly, her heart thumping a strange, irregular rhythm. Caleb opened the gate and stepped through. He knelt in the dust so he was eye level with the child. "You never come at a horse from behind," Caleb instructed seriously. "And you do not put your fingers up like claws. They think you are trying to pinch them." He took Maggie's small hand in his large, scarred one. His skin was rough, blackened with axle grease and old calluses, but his touch was incredibly light. "Make your hand flat," he said, guiding her palm open. "Like a plate. Let her come to you." Maggie held her breath. Caleb guided her hand toward the mare's velvet nose. Smoke stretched her neck out, sniffed the small palm, and then nudged it gently, looking for more treats. "She is soft," Maggie squealed, a pure, bubbling sound of joy. Abby stood frozen, watching them. She saw the way Caleb's dark hair fell over his forehead, the way his large body curved protectively around her daughter without crowding her. She saw the patience in his face, a face she had been told was dangerous. For a moment, the harshness of Red Rock Crossing fell away. There was just the sunlight, the smell of hay, and a man teaching a child to be unafraid. A flicker of warmth sparked in Abby's chest, sudden and sharp. It terrified her. Hope was a dangerous thing to feel in a place like this. It was the precursor to loss. She stepped back, her hand going to her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Ward. We should go in." Caleb stood up, the spell breaking. He adjusted his hat, his face returning to its usual stoic mask. "Of course," he said. Abby hurried Maggie back to the house, but before she closed the door, she looked back. Caleb was standing by the fence, watching them, one hand resting absently on the mare's neck. 2 days later, the reality of their precarious position came crashing back. Abby had been sent to the general store to fetch a sack of cornmeal for the boarding house kitchen. The bell jingled as she entered. The store was empty of customers, but the air felt heavy. Victor Hale emerged from the back office. He was wiping his mouth with a handkerchief, his eyes brightening when he saw her. "Mrs. Cole," he said, coming around the counter. "A pleasure. As always, Mr. Hale," Abby said, keeping her voice neutral. "Just the cornmeal today. Please, Mrs. Briggs is waiting." Victor leaned against the counter, blocking her path to the dry goods. "You know, I have been thinking about your situation. It keeps me up at night, worrying about a delicate woman like yourself scrubbing floors." "I do not mind the work," Abby said, tightening her grip on her basket. "But surely you want more." Victor purred. He took a step closer. The smell of his bay rum cologne was overpowering. "I have a position opening up. In the saloon. Nothing strenuous, just serving drinks, talking to the men, making them feel welcome." Abby went cold. She knew exactly what kind of talking he meant. "I am not interested. Thank you. The pay is good." Victor pressed, his voice dropping. "Very good. Enough to buy pretty things. Enough to live on your own." "Of course. The saloon is no place for a child, but there are arrangements for that. I know a family in the next county. They take in orphans, or children who need new starts." The implication hit Abby like a physical blow. He was suggesting she sell herself and discard Maggie like unwanted luggage. "My daughter stays with me," Abby said, her voice shaking with rage. "And I would rather starve than work in your saloon." Victor's smile vanished. His eyes turned flat and cold. The eyes of a reptile. "You are very proud for a woman with nothing," he sneered. "Do not think you are special, Abigail. Men may want a warm body for a night, but nobody wants a broken woman with a bastard child dragging behind her. You will come begging to me eventually." Abby backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I will never beg you for anything." She turned and fled the store, nearly colliding with a figure in the doorway. It was Caleb. He was standing just inside the entrance, hidden by the shadows of the doorframe. His body was rigid, his fists clenched at his sides so tight the knuckles were white. His jaw worked, a muscle jumping under the scar. He had heard every word. Abby looked at him, humiliated that he had witnessed her shame. Caleb looked past her at Victor, a murderous light in his gray eyes. He took a half-step forward, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip. "Don't," Abby whispered. "Please." Caleb stopped. He looked down at her. He saw the tears standing in her eyes, but he also saw the way she held her chin high. She was not asking for a savior. She was asking for dignity. If he fought Victor now, it would only confirm the town's gossip, that she was a woman men fought over, a source of trouble. He slowly unclenched his fists. He nodded to her. A sharp, jerky motion. "Go on, ma'am," he grated out. Abby slipped past him into the street. Caleb stayed for a long moment, staring at Victor Hale. Victor smirked, secure in his power and his property. Caleb held the look until Victor's smirk faltered, then turned and walked out, the silence stretching taut behind him. The following Saturday was market day. The town was crowded with ranchers and farmers in for supplies. Wagons clogged the main street, and the wooden sidewalks were a gauntlet of judging eyes. Abby had to go out. They needed food. She walked with Maggie's hand crushed in hers, eyes fixed straight ahead. As they passed the mercantile, a group of 3 women from the church stood near a display of fabric. They stopped talking as Abby approached. The silence was louder than any shout. Then, as Abby passed, the whispers started, bold as brass. Walking around like that. Heard she refused honest work to try and trap a husband. No decent man would touch her, not with another man's sin in tow. Abby heard them. The words were like needles. No decent man. She felt the heat flood her face, a burning shame that made her eyes sting. She squeezed Maggie's hand so hard the girl whimpered. "I'm sorry, baby," Abby murmured, loosening her grip. She hurried toward the dry goods counter, her vision blurring. She fumbled with the list in her hand. She bought a small sack of flour, her hands trembling as she counted out the coins. She turned to leave, hoisting the 20-pound sack onto her hip, balancing it awkwardly against Maggie's weight on her other side. "Allow me, ma'am." Caleb was there. He didn't wait for permission. He reached out and took the flour sack from her arms. As the weight transferred, his hand brushed against hers. It wasn't a quick graze. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second against her wrist. His skin was rough, warm, and solid. Abby gasped softly. The contact sent a shock through her, a sudden jolt of awareness that froze them both in the middle of the crowded street. For a heartbeat, the noise of the market faded. She looked up and met his eyes. There was no judgment there, only a quiet, steady resolve. He was claiming her burden. In front of everyone. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb nodded, shifting the sack to his shoulder. He walked beside her, placing his body between her and the whispering women. He did not say a word to them, but his presence was a shield. He walked them all the way to the boarding house steps, set the flour down, touched his hat, and left. The whispers followed him, but Abby didn't care. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. That night, the weather turned. A blue norther swept down from the mountains, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in an hour. The wind howled around the eaves of the boarding house, rattling the loose shutters like frantic ghosts. Inside, the kitchen stove was smoking badly, the draft pushing soot back down the chimney. Mrs. Briggs was in a foul mood. "We need more wood," she barked at Abby. "The box is empty. Go out to the pile and bring in the oak. And hurry, before the fire dies completely." Abby threw a thin shawl over her shoulders and went out the back door. The cold hit her like a slap. The wind bit through her threadbare dress, chilling her to the bone instantly. The yard was pitch black, save for the faint yellow square of light from the kitchen window. She fumbled her way to the woodpile, her teeth chattering. The logs were heavy and rough. She tried to stack them in her arms, but her fingers were numb and clumsy. A log slipped and fell on her foot. She bit back a cry of pain and frustration, tears leaking from her eyes to freeze on her cheeks. "Here, let me!" The voice came from the darkness near the stable fence. Caleb emerged from the shadows. He had just returned from the ranch. He was still wearing his duster, coated in road dust, and he smelled of the cold night air and leather. He didn't ask. He simply stepped in and began stacking wood into the crook of her arm, then gathered a larger load for himself. "It is a bitter night," he said quietly. "It bites," Abby said, shivering violently. "This land, it hates us. I think—" Caleb paused, holding a split log. "It does not hate us, Abby. It just does not care. It is hard, but it is honest. It gives what you put into it. Mostly." He looked up at the sky, where clouds were racing across the moon. "It feels like punishment sometimes," he admitted, his voice rough. "But it feels like comfort, too. It is big enough to swallow a man's past, if he lets it." They walked to the back porch, shielded from the wind by the wall of the house. They dumped the wood into the bin by the door, but neither of them moved to go inside immediately. The small space created a sudden, intense intimacy. They were two warm bodies in a freezing world. Abby looked at him in the dim light. The scar on his face looked stark, a map of pain he carried every day. She felt a sudden, desperate need to be known, to be seen not as a project or a victim, but as a person. "They call me a widow," she said. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "But I am not." Caleb went still. He did not look away. "I was never married," she continued, her voice trembling. "Maggie's father, he was a man in our town. He promised me the world. When I told him I was with child, he left the next day, moved west." She wrapped her shawl tighter, staring at her boots. "The church called me a sinner. My parents, they told me to leave Maggie at an asylum. They said we could pretend it never happened. Make it right." She looked up at Caleb, defiance warring with shame in her eyes. "I could not do it." I looked at her, and I could not let her go. So I ran, and I have been running ever since. Caleb listened, and he felt a rage ignite in his gut that was hotter than any fire. He hated the man who had left her. He hated the parents who would discard their own blood. But mostly, he was awestruck by the woman standing before him. She was small and shivering, but she had the heart of a lion. He stepped closer. The wind whipped his duster around his legs. "That man was a fool," Caleb said. His voice was a low growl. "And your parents were blind. You did not do wrong, Abby. You protected your own. That is the only law that matters." He took a breath, the cold air searing his lungs. "I know about running." Abby looked at him, waiting. Caleb looked out at the dark yard. "I rode in the border wars, down in Texas. We were supposed to be protecting cattle, but it turned into a war. There was a night, a dispute over a herd. We rode into a settlement. There was shooting, so much smoke." His voice cracked. "I fired at a shape in a window. I thought it was a rifleman. When the smoke cleared, it was a boy. He was not much older than Maggie." Abby sucked in a breath. She reached out instinctively, her hand hovering near his arm. "I see his face every night," Caleb whispered. "I came here to be alone, because I am not clean. Abby, I have blood on me that will not wash off. I do not deserve this peace. A family." He looked at her then, his eyes raw and unguarded. They stood in the silence of their shared brokenness. Two people discarded by the world, finding themselves standing in the same shadow. The wind cut through them, forcing them to stand closer for warmth. Caleb reached for a piece of wood on the top of the pile to adjust it, and Abby reached at the same time. Their hands met. This time, neither pulled away. Caleb's hand covered hers, large and encompassing. His thumb brushed the back of her frozen knuckles. The heat of his skin was shocking. They froze, breaths mingling in white clouds in the darkness. Abby looked up at his lips, then at his eyes. She saw a hunger there that mirrored her own, a desperate, aching need for softness, for connection, for someone to hold on to in the dark. She swayed toward him. She wanted to lean her head against his chest. She wanted to bury her face in his coat and forget the cold, the work, the shame. Caleb's hand tightened on hers. He leaned in, just an inch. The air between them crackled, but then fear surged in Abby's chest. Fear of what this meant. Fear of losing him if he knew the full weight of her need. Fear that she would ruin him just by being near him. She stepped back, pulling her hand from his warmth. The loss of contact was a physical pain. I have to go in, she whispered, panic rising in her voice. Mrs. Briggs. Caleb stopped. He blinked, the mask slamming back down over his features. He straightened up, stepping back into the cold. Yes, he said roughly. Go inside, Abby, before you freeze. He tipped his hat, turning his face away so she wouldn't see the despair in his eyes. He walked away into the darkness, toward the barn, leaving Abby standing on the porch, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sky over Red Rock Crossing turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and sagging with unshed water. When the rain finally broke, it did not come as a relief but as a punishment. It fell in cold, gray sheets that hammered the roof of the boarding house and turned the main street into a quagmire of sucking mud. The dust that had choked the town for weeks was replaced by a damp chill that seeped into the bones and refused to leave. For Abby, the storm brought a new kind of desperation. With the roads turned to sludge, the stagecoaches stopped running for 3 days. Travelers hunkered down in larger cities to the east or west, bypassing the small, miserable stop of Red Rock. The laundry that usually provided Abby's meager income dwindled to nothing. There were no shirts to scrub, no linens to press. On Friday morning, Abby stood in the kitchen of the boarding house, her hands red from the cold water of the pump. Mrs. Briggs sat at the table, counting coins into a tin box. The sound of the metal clinking was sharp in the quiet room. Mrs. Briggs did not look up as she spoke. You are short this week, Mrs. Cole. Abby dried her hands on her apron, her stomach tightening. It is the rain. Mrs. Briggs, the coaches have not come. There is no work. That is hardly my concern. Is it? Hattie Briggs snapped the lid of the box shut. I have coal to buy. I have flour to purchase. This is a business, not a poorhouse. I will make it up, Abby promised, her voice thin. As soon as the sun comes out, I will take double shifts. I will scrub the siding. I will clean the stables. Hattie looked at her then, her eyes hard and evaluating. She looked at Abby's face, which was pale, but still held a delicate beauty that the harsh weather had not yet eroded. You know, Hattie said, leaning back in her chair, there are other ways for a woman to make rent. Abby stiffened. I do not understand. Oh, stop playing the innocent, Hattie scoffed. You are a pretty woman, despite your sour expression. There are men in this town, lonely men with money, who would be happy to help a struggling mother. If you were to find a gentleman friend, someone to sponsor you, the rent would not be such a burden. Abby felt the blood drain from her face. You are suggesting I sell myself. I am suggesting you be practical. Hattie stood up, bracing her hands on the table. You are one payment away from the street, Abigail. And let me tell you, the street is a lot colder than a warm bed. You have until Monday to find the money, or you and that child can sleep in the mud. Abby turned and fled the kitchen, the laughter of the rain against the windows sounding like a chorus of mockery. The rain continued through Saturday. The town felt closed in, the horizon erased by the gray curtain of the storm. Abby spent the morning trying to mend Maggie's only pair of shoes, which were splitting at the sole. She sat in the parlor, near the window to catch the gray light, sewing with fierce, angry stitches. The front door opened, letting in a gust of wet wind and the smell of bay rum. Victor Hale shook out his umbrella and stomped the mud from his expensive boots. He looked around the empty parlor and smiled when his eyes landed on Abby. "Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Working hard. I see." Abby did not look up. "Good day, Mr. Hale." Victor walked into the room, unbuttoning his damp coat. He moved with the arrogance of a man who owned the mortgage on half the buildings in town. He stopped in front of her chair, looming over her. "I spoke with Hattie," he said quietly. "She tells me you are having trouble meeting your obligations." Abby's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A bead of bright red blood welled up. She stuck her finger in her mouth, tasting the copper, and looked up at him with cold eyes. "Mrs. Briggs talks too much. She is a businesswoman," Victor said, shrugging. "And so am I. I hate to see a woman of your potential struggling over pennies." He pulled a chair close, too close, and sat down. His knees brushed against her skirts. Abby pulled her legs back, pressing herself into the corner of the settee. "I made you an offer before, Abigail. You were too proud to take it, but pride does not buy shoes for the little one." "Does it? I told you," Abby said, her voice shaking. "I will not work in your saloon." Victor sighed, as if explaining simple arithmetic to a child. "It is not just about the work. I am offering to pay your debt to Hattie. All of it. I will set you up in a room above the store. Nice furniture. Heat. All you have to do is be hospitable. Entertain a few of my business associates when they come through town. And me. Of course." Abby felt bile rise in her throat. She stood up, clutching the shoe to her chest. "Get out." Victor stood too, his face darkening. "I am not finished. I know the child is the problem. A man does not want a screaming brat around when he is looking for comfort. But I am a generous man. I have contacted a church home in St. Louis. They take in bastards. They will raise her to be a servant. It is a good life. Better than she will have here with a whore for a mother." The slap echoed through the room before Abby even realized she had moved. Her hand burned from the impact against his cheek. Victor's head snapped to the side. For a second, there was silence. Then he turned back to her, his eyes filled with a terrifying, cold rage. "You ungrateful little bitch." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His fingers were like iron bands, crushing the delicate bones. Abby cried out, dropping the shoe. "You are hurting me." Victor yanked her toward him, twisting her arm behind her back. "You think you are too good for me. You are nothing. You are used goods that washed up in the dirt. I am trying to save you. And you strike me? Let me go," Abby screamed, stomping her heel down onto the instep of his boot. Victor grunted in pain and loosened his grip just enough for Abby to rip her arm free. She stumbled back, crashing into a small side table. A porcelain vase shattered on the floor. The commotion brought people running. Mrs. Briggs appeared from the kitchen, and Mrs. Gable, who had been coming down the stairs, froze on the landing. "What is the meaning of this?" Hattie demanded. Victor straightened his coat, smoothing his hair. He looked at the women, his face composing itself into a mask of offended dignity. "I came here to offer Mrs. Cole charity," Victor said, his voice trembling with feigned hurt. "I offered to help pay her rent out of the kindness of my heart, and she attacked me like a wild animal." "Mrs." Gable looked at the shattered vase, then at Abby, who was clutching her throbbing wrist, her chest heaving. "She is unhinged," Victor added, shaking his head. "I fear for the child's safety." Abby stared at them, horror dawning on her. They believed him. Of course they believed him. He was Victor Hale, and she was nobody. "Get out," Abby whispered. "I am leaving," Victor sneered. "But do not expect any more charity from this town. Abigail, you have made your bed." He turned and marched out. Mrs. Gable descended the stairs, her skirts rustling. She looked at Abby with pure disgust. To strike a man who was only trying to help, Mrs. Gable murmured. You really are beyond redemption. By the next morning, the story had twisted and grown like a poisonous vine. The whispers in the street were no longer just judgmental. They were hostile. Abby walked to the well to draw water, and women turned their backs. Men spat in the mud as she passed. Too proud to work. Attacked Mr. Hale. Should be grateful anyone looks at her at all. The town was closing in. The gray sky felt like a ceiling lowering inch by inch, threatening to crush her. Up in the attic room, Maggie sat on the bed, playing with a doll made of rags. She stopped when Abby came in, locking the door behind her with trembling hands. Mama? Maggie asked softly. Abby forced a smile, though her wrist throbbed with a deep, aching cadence. Yes. Sweet girl? Are we going to have to leave? The question stopped Abby cold. She went to the bed and sat down, pulling Maggie into her lap. She buried her face in the child's soft hair, smelling the scent of lavender soap and innocence. Why do you ask that? I heard Mrs. Briggs yelling, and the man with the shiny boots, he sounded scary. Abby held her tighter. We are not going anywhere. Maggie, I promise. But where will we sleep if she locks the door? Abby pulled back, gripping Maggie's shoulders. I will never let you sleep in the rain. Do you hear me? I will fight every person in this town before I let that happen. We are a team. You and I, nobody breaks us apart. She said the words with a ferocity that startled even herself. But as she held her daughter, looking at the rain streaking the window, she realized she had no idea how she would keep that promise. The rain finally stopped on Sunday afternoon, leaving the world sodden and brown. Caleb rode into town around 3 o'clock. He had spent the last 3 days at the ranch, battling the mud to keep the herd from scattering. He was exhausted, his duster heavy with damp, his hat shapeless. He tied his horse at the rail and walked toward the boarding house. He told himself he was just checking to see if they had weathered the storm. He told himself it was just neighborly concern. He found Abby sitting on the front steps. She was not crying. She was just staring at a puddle in the middle of the street, her expression one of utter defeat. She wore a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, but her hands were bare, resting on her knees. As Caleb approached, his boots sucking in the mud, he saw it. A ring of dark purple and black bruises encircled her right wrist. It looked like a shackle made of flesh. Caleb stopped at the bottom of the steps. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. Abby looked up, startled. She instinctively pulled her hand under her shawl. Caleb, she said, her voice attempting cheerfulness but failing. I did not hear you ride up. Who did that? His voice was not loud. It was soft, terrible, and completely devoid of emotion. Abby looked away. I fell. On the stairs. It is slippery with the rain. Do not lie to me. Abby. Caleb walked up 2 steps until he was standing over her. He did not touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. Who put his hands on you? Abby looked at his face. The scar stood out white against his tanned skin. His gray eyes were churning with a violence she had only glimpsed before. She saw the lethal capability in him, and she was afraid, but beneath the fear, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of safety. Here was a man who was angry for her, not at her. It was Victor Hale. She whispered. Caleb went very still. What did he want? He offered to pay my rent, if I would be with him, and if I sent Maggie away. The silence that followed stretched out for 5 long seconds. Caleb looked at the bruise hidden under her shawl. He looked at the boarding house door. He looked at the muddy street. He tried to take Maggie? Caleb asked. He said he would find a home for her. Caleb nodded slowly. He adjusted his hat. He turned and walked down the steps. Caleb! Abby scrambled up, panic seizing her. Where are you going? To the saloon! No! Abby ran down the steps, splashing into the mud, grabbing his arm. His muscles were rock hard under the wet canvas of his coat. You cannot. He owns the town. Caleb, if you touch him, the sheriff will arrest you. You will lose your job. Please, It is not worth it. Caleb looked down at her hand on his arm. He gently covered it with his own, his fingers brushing the skin just above the bruise. He put his hands on you. Caleb said, That makes it worth it. He gently disengaged her grip and turned away. Go inside, Abby. The Lucky Horseshoe Saloon was a warm, golden refuge from the gray afternoon. Lanterns hissed softly, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, stale beer, and damp wool. Victor Hale sat at his usual table, playing poker with the banker and 2 cattle buyers. He was laughing at a joke, his gold tooth flashing in the lamplight. The swinging doors banged open. They didn't swing shut. Caleb Ward stood in the opening, silhouetted against the gray light outside. The conversation in the saloon died. It didn't taper off. It was cut. Men looked at Caleb, then followed his gaze to Victor. They saw the set of Caleb's shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, near his guns but not touching them. Victor looked up, annoyed. Well, if it is not the White Knight, come to beg for a job. Ward. Caleb walked into the room. His spurs chimed. Ching, 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 a rhythm of approaching judgment. He stopped 5 feet from the table. Stand up, Caleb said. Victor laughed, though it sounded nervous. I am in the middle of a hand. Cowboy, go sleep it off in the stable. I said stand up. Victor threw his cards down. He stood, puffing out his chest. Listen to me, you scar-faced drifter. I know why you are here. That woman came whining to you, didn't she? Did she tell you how she scratched me? Did she tell you she is crazy? She told me you like to hurt women. Caleb said. Victor sneered. I made her a business proposition. It is not my fault she thinks she is a queen. And you? What is she to you? Your whore? Are you waiting for your turn? The insult hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Caleb moved. It was not a wild swing. It was a piston of motion, efficient and brutal. His right fist connected with Victor's mouth. There was a sickening crack of splitting lip and breaking teeth. Victor didn't just fall, he was lifted off his feet. He crashed backward into the table, shattering it. Cards and poker chips exploded into the air like confetti. Victor sprawled in the sawdust, blood pouring from his mouth, his eyes rolling back in his head. The room erupted. 2 of Victor's friends jumped up, hands going to their belts. Caleb stepped back, his hand hovering over his Colt. Don't! He barked. The sheer authority in his voice froze them. Suddenly, the sheriff, a weary man named Miller, who had been drinking coffee in the corner, was between them. His shotgun leveled. Enough, Miller shouted. Back off, all of you. Caleb did not take his eyes off Victor, who was groaning and spitting blood onto the floor. Miller looked at the wreckage of the table, then at Caleb. God damn it. Ward, I told you I wanted peace in this town. He insulted a lady, Caleb said, his voice flat. He is the town council head. Miller lowered the shotgun but kept it ready. You cannot just walk in here and smash a man's face in because you do not like his manners. He touched her, Caleb said. Next time, I will not use my fist. Miller stepped close to Caleb, his voice dropping to a hiss. You are on thin ice, son. Victor will want your hide for this. I can arrest you right now for assault. Do it, Caleb challenged. Miller sighed, rubbing his temple. Get out of here, Caleb. Ride out. If I see you in town before sunrise, I am locking you up, and if you touch him again, I will have to shoot you. Do you understand? Caleb looked at Victor one last time, etching the image of the man's pain into his mind. Then he turned and walked out, his back straight, leaving the saloon in a stunned silence. 20 minutes later, Caleb entered the livery stable. The barn was dim and quiet. The only sound the soft chewing of horses and the drumming of rain on the roof. The air smelled of sweet hay and manure. Abby was there. She was standing in the stall with the gray mare. Smoke. She had her forehead pressed against the horse's neck, her shoulders shaking. When she heard Caleb's boots, she spun around. She saw the split skin on his knuckles, the blood that wasn't his. She saw the wild, adrenaline-fueled light in his eyes. You did it, she whispered. You fought him. Caleb walked to the stall door. He hit the table. He said, He will not be smiling for a while. Abby rushed out of the stall and shoved him. It was a weak shove, born of fear, but it made him stumble back a step. "Are you insane?" she cried. "The sheriff could have killed you. Victor could have shot you. Why would you do that?" "Because he hurt you," Caleb shouted back, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Because I could not sit on a horse and mend fences, knowing he was walking around laughing about it. I did not ask you to," Abby yelled, tears streaming down her face. "I did not ask you to be my hero. Caleb, I am trying to survive here. You are not surviving." Caleb stepped into her space, looming over her. "You are drowning, Abby, and I am the only one watching it happen." They were standing inches apart in the narrow aisle between the stalls. The air was charged with the smell of ozone and sweat. Abby looked up at him, her chest heaving. She saw the raw desperation in his face, the need to protect her that was so fierce it was almost violent. "I am scared," she whispered, her anger draining away to reveal the terrified woman beneath. "I am so scared. Caleb, every day I feel like the ground is crumbling under me." Caleb's expression shattered. The anger vanished, replaced by an agonizing tenderness. He reached out with his damaged hand and gently, so gently, cupped her bruised wrist. "I will hold the ground," he murmured. "I will hold it for you." Abby looked at his mouth. She looked at the scar that marred his cheek. She saw the man who had carried her trunk, who had given her daughter a peppermint, who had just risked his life to defend her honor when she had none left. The distance between them evaporated. It wasn't clear who moved first. Maybe both of them. Abby surged up on her toes. Caleb bowed his head. Their mouths met with a desperate, crushing force. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of two lonely, starving souls. Caleb's arms went around her, pulling her body hard against his, lifting her slightly off the ground. Abby's hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer, deeper. She tasted the salt of her own tears and the metallic tang of blood from his split lip. She felt the rough wool of his coat and the heat of the man beneath it. For the first time in years, she didn't feel cold. She felt like she was burning alive, and it was glorious. The world narrowed down to the sound of their ragged breathing and the rain on the roof. "Mama?" The voice was small and sleepy, coming from the barn door. Abby gasped and tore herself away from Caleb. She stumbled back against the stall door, her hand flying to her mouth. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a sledgehammer. Maggie was standing in the doorway, holding her rag doll, rubbing her eyes. "I woke up and you were gone." Abby's chest heaved. She looked at Maggie, then at Caleb. Caleb stood frozen, his eyes blown wide, his lips swollen and red. He looked like a man who had just seen God and the devil in the same instant. I am here." "Maggie," Abby stammered, smoothing her hair with shaking hands. "I was just checking on the horse." She turned to Caleb. Her eyes were filled with panic now. The reality of what they had done, what they were doing, crashed down on her. "You have to go," she whispered to him. "Abby?" Caleb started, taking a step forward. "No." Abby backed away, putting herself between him and Maggie. "Look at us. Caleb, look at this mess. The whole town thinks I'm a whore. If they see us, if they know, they will run you out too. I do not care about the town," Caleb said fiercely. "I do," Abby cried. "I cannot drag you down with me. You have a job. You have a life. I am just baggage." "You are not baggage," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "You are the only real thing in this whole damn territory." Abby squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, just go. Before the sheriff comes back, please." Caleb looked at her, at the plea in her posture. He looked at Maggie, who was watching them with wide, confused eyes. He knew he couldn't fight her fear tonight. He nodded once, sharp and painful. He touched the brim of his hat. "I will be at the ranch," he said hoarsely. "If you need me, I will be there." He turned and walked out into the rain, mounting his horse and riding hard toward the open range, trying to outrun the fire in his blood. 2 days passed. The mud began to dry into a hard, cracked crust. On Tuesday morning, a rider from the east arrived on a lathered horse. He was a mail carrier, making a special run for the bank, but he carried a few personal letters in his saddlebag. He stopped at the boarding house. "Mrs. Cole," he asked Hattie, "who was sweeping the porch?" Hattie took the letter he offered. She looked at the return address, her eyebrows raising. She walked inside and found Abby in the kitchen. "For you," Hattie said, dropping the envelope on the table. "From Ohio." Abby picked it up. Her hands trembled. It was not from her parents. It was from Mrs. Higgins, an old neighbor who had been kind to her when she was a child. Abby tore it open. "Dear Abigail, I write this in haste and with a heavy heart. I felt you should know that the elders of the Grace Community Church have discovered where you have gone. Deacon Miller has written a letter to the Reverend in Red Rock Crossing. He has detailed your indiscretions and warned the flock there to guard their moral standing against your influence. He claims it is his duty to warn other God-fearing men. My dear girl, please be careful. Prejudice has long legs." Abby dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. The prejudice she had fled across half a continent had followed her. It wasn't enough that they had driven her out. They wanted to ensure she found no sanctuary anywhere. She looked out the window toward the north, toward the Barty Ranch. She thought of Caleb. She thought of the kiss in the stable, the way he had looked at her with such raw hope. She was trapped. If she stayed, the church would crucify her. And if Caleb stood with her, they would crucify him too. The past had caught up, and it was bringing a hammer. Reverend Elias Trent was a man carved from the same hard oak as the pews in his church. He was tall, gaunt, and possessed a voice that could rattle the window panes without the aid of shouting. He believed in a God of iron and fire, a God who demanded order above all else. When the letter from Ohio arrived on his desk, carried by the malice of a deacon 2,000 miles away, Trent read it not with sorrow, but with the grim satisfaction of a general identifying a breach in the fortifications. On Sunday morning, the bell in the white steeple tolled with a hollow, metallic clang that drifted over the brown hills. The air was already hot at 9 o'clock, the sky a flat, unforgiving sheet of blue. Abby walked into the church with her head down, holding Maggie's hand. She took a seat in the very last pew, nearest the door. She felt the eyes of the congregation sliding over her back like oil. She fixed her gaze on the hymnal in her lap, smoothing the pages to keep her hands from shaking. Reverend Trent stood at the pulpit. He did not smile. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand until his knuckles turned white. "There is a sickness that comes to a town," Trent began, his voice low and resonant. "It does not come with a cough. It does not come with a fever. It comes quietly. It comes cloaked in the guise of a neighbor or a traveler." He paused, letting the silence stretch until the shuffling of feet stopped completely. "Scripture tells us to guard the flock," he thundered suddenly. "It tells us that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. We have allowed sin to walk among us. Brothers and sisters, we have allowed the unclean thing to sit in our pews and breathe our air, thinking that silence is the same as mercy." Abby stopped breathing. Beside her, Maggie swung her legs, happily watching a fly buzz against the glass, oblivious to the weaponized words filling the room. "I have received word," Trent continued, lifting a piece of paper from the pulpit. "Word from a godly community back east. They speak of a woman who fled her judgment, a woman who carries the fruit of her immorality on her hip like a badge of honor." A rustle went through the room. Heads turned, not all at once, but in a slow, rippling wave. They looked at Abby, the matrons with their tight bonnets, the ranchers with their sunburned necks, the shopkeepers. Their faces were masks of pious disgust. "We cannot ask the Lord to bless Red Rock Crossing while we harbor the unrepentant," Trent shouted, slamming his hand down. "No man wanted a woman who was broken by her own sin, and neither should this town. We must purge the dross, or we shall all be consumed by the fire." Abby grabbed Maggie's hand. She stood up, her legs trembling so violently she nearly fell. She walked out of the church, the sound of the preacher's voice chasing her into the sunlight like a pack of hounds. She did not run, but she walked fast, tears burning hot tracks through the dust on her cheeks. The aftermath was swift. That afternoon, Mrs. Hattie Briggs stood on the porch of the boarding house. She was faced by a delegation of 3 women, led by Mrs. Gable. They stood with their arms crossed, their faces set in lines of grim determination. "We cannot in good conscience recommend your establishment to travelers." "Hattie, Mrs. Gable said, adjusting her gloves. "Not if you run a house of ill repute." "It is a boarding house," Hattie protested, though her voice wavered. "It is a harbor for that woman." "Mrs. Gable countered. The Reverend was clear. "If she stays, decent folks will not." "You choose, Hattie. Her rent or your reputation." When the women left, Hattie went straight to the kitchen where Abby was peeling potatoes. Hattie looked old and tired. The hard lines of her face were sagging. "You heard them," Hattie said dully. Abby put down the knife. "I heard. You have until the last day of the month." Hattie said, "That is 6 days. Abigail, after that, I cannot keep you. I have a business to run." Abby felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Mrs. Briggs, please, I have nowhere to go. I have $4 to my name. Then you best find a way to get more. Or find a man who will take you in," Hattie said, turning away to hide the shame in her eyes. "But you cannot stay here." While the town tightened its noose around Abby, the land began to strangle the ranch. A drought settled over the territory with the weight of a heavy wool blanket. The rain from the previous week had been a cruel tease, wetting the surface only to evaporate within hours. Now, the wind blew hot and dry from the south, sucking the moisture out of the soil. At the Bar T Ranch, the creek beds turned to cracked puzzles of dried mud. The cattle grew listless, their ribs beginning to show through their hides as the grass turned to yellow straw. Caleb Ward spent his days in a haze of dust and exhaustion. He rode from sunup to sundown, driving cattle to the few remaining waterholes in the high country. His face was coated in grit, his lips cracked and bleeding. On Wednesday, the ranch foreman, a hard man named Silas, rode up alongside him. "Ward," Silas grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice at a lizard. "I heard about the ruckus in town. With Hale." Caleb did not look up from the cinch he was tightening. He had it coming. Silas shifted in his saddle. "Maybe so, but Hale holds the note on the boss's feed supply. He was out here yesterday, talking about calling in debts. He mentioned your name. Said he did not like the company we keep." Caleb froze. He looked at Silas. "I am not telling you how to live your life." "Caleb," Silas said, tipping his hat back, "you are the best hand I have, but if you bring a war down on this ranch, the boss will cut you loose. We cannot afford to fight Victor Hale's money." "I understand," Caleb said, his voice rough. "You steer clear of that woman." "Son," Silas advised, turning his horse, "there is nothing but trouble down that road." Caleb watched him ride away. He looked at his hands, scarred and dirty. He thought of Abby's face in the stable, the way she had tasted of tears and desperation. He knew he should stay away. He knew it was the only smart thing to do. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing alone against the whole world. Trouble, when it finally struck the attic room, did not come in the form of a landlord or a preacher. It came in the night, silent and burning. It started on Thursday evening. Maggie complained that her head hurt. By midnight, she was thrashing in the narrow bed, her skin radiating a heat that terrified Abby. The attic was drafty, the wind whistling through the gaps in the eaves, but the air in the room felt stagnant. Abby sat on the edge of the bed, dipping a rag into a bowl of tepid water and wiping Maggie's forehead. "Mama, it is cold," Maggie whimpered, her teeth chattering even as her skin burned. "Shh, baby, it is okay." "I am here," Abby whispered. By 3 a.m, Maggie was delirious. She was talking to people who weren't there, calling out for her doll, crying about the dust. Her breathing was shallow and fast, a terrifying rasping sound that filled the small room. Abby ran downstairs to the kitchen to get fresh water. She found Hattie sitting by the stove, nursing a cup of tea. "She is burning up," Abby said, panic making her voice shrill. I need the doctor. Dr. Evans is gone, Hattie said, not unkindly. He rode out to the Miller place yesterday for a birthing. He will not be back for 2 days. 2 days? Abby stared at her. She will not last 2 days. Hattie, she is burning. Hattie stood up and felt the water pitcher Abby was holding. It is the bad water, likely, or the drafts. I have some willow bark tea, but willow bark will not break this fever, Abby cried. She needs real medicine. She needs help. She ran back upstairs. Maggie was still, her eyes half open and glassy. Abby touched her chest. The heat was terrifying. It felt like a fire was consuming the small body from the inside out. Abby fell to her knees beside the bed. She clasped her hands so tight her fingernails dug into her skin. Please, she whispered to the ceiling. Please, God, I know I am a sinner. I know I ran away, but do not take her. Take me. Punish me. But do not take my baby. The silence of the room was her only answer. Abby realized then that she could not pray this fever away. She could not hide in this attic and wait for death to knock. She stood up. She grabbed the thickest wool blanket she owned. She wrapped Maggie in it, lifting the child's dead weight into her arms. Maggie moaned, but did not wake. Abby carried her downstairs. She went out the back door into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cold, a sharp contrast to the heat of the day. She went to the stable. Hattie's old plow horse was there, asleep in his stall. Abby did not ask permission. She threw a bridle over the horse's head, not bothering with a saddle. She dragged a mounting block over, clutching Maggie tight to her chest, and climbed onto the horse's broad back. She kicked the horse into a lumbering trot, heading north, toward the bar T, toward the only person in the world who had ever offered her a hand without asking for a piece of her soul in return. The prairie before dawn was a landscape of gray ghosts. The sagebrush looked like crouching men. The wind bit through Abby's thin shawl, numbing her fingers, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was the burning heat of Maggie's body pressed against her stomach. She rode for an hour, the horse stumbling in the dark. The sky began to lighten to a bruised purple in the east when she saw the gate of the bar T. She rode into the yard just as the ranch was waking up. A few hands were washing their faces at the trough. They stopped and stared as the woman on the plow horse rode in, hair wild, clutching a bundle. "Caleb!" Abby screamed, her voice cracking. "Caleb!" The door to the bunkhouse flew open. Caleb stepped out. He was shirtless, pulling on his suspenders, his hair standing up from sleep. He saw her and was moving before he even fully registered who it was. He ran to the horse as Abby slid down, her legs giving out. He caught her and the child before they hit the dust. "Abby, what is it? What happened? It is Maggie!" Abby sobbed, thrusting the bundle at him. "She is burning. Caleb, the doctor is gone. She is not waking up." Caleb looked down at the child in his arms. Maggie's face was flushed a dark, unnatural red. Her breath was coming in short, hitching gasps. He touched her cheek with the back of his hand and pulled it away as if he had touched a stove. "Get her inside." Caleb barked at the staring ranch hands. He carried Maggie into the foreman's office, kicking the door open. He laid her on the leather sofa. Silas, the foreman, came in, tucking his shirt in. "What in the hell is going on? She is sick," Caleb said, his voice tight. "High fever." Silas looked at the child, then at Abby, who was standing in the doorway, shivering violently. "This is a bunkhouse. Caleb, not a hospital. She needs Mrs. Yoder," Caleb said, ignoring him. "The old German woman?" Silas asked. "She is 20 miles out, near the canyon. She has the medicines," Caleb said. He turned to Abby. "Mrs. Yoder saved a boy last winter with the lung fever. She knows herbs. She knows what to do." "I will go," Abby said, trying to step forward. "You will not make it 5 miles on that plow horse," Caleb said. "Stay here. Keep her cool. Wet cloths on her head. Do not let her get chilled. But keep the fever down." He turned to Silas. "I am taking the roan. The roan is tired," Silas warned. "Then I will ride him until he drops and walk the rest of the way." Caleb snapped. He grabbed his coat and hat. He paused in front of Abby. He put his hands on her shoulders, gripping her hard. "I will be back," he said. I promise." He was gone before she could answer. She heard the thunder of hooves fading into the distance. The ride to Mrs. Yoder's homestead was a gauntlet. Caleb pushed the roan gelding hard, galloping across the dry wash and up the rocky slopes of the foothills. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth. Instead, the sky turned a strange, sickly green color. Halfway to the canyon, the weather broke. It wasn't rain this time. It was hail. It started with a few icy stones the size of marbles, bouncing off his hat brim. Within minutes, the sky opened up. Ice the size of walnuts hammered down from the heavens. The noise was deafening, a roar of impact that drowned out his own thoughts. The horse reared, terrified as the ice stung its flanks. Caleb fought the reins, keeping the animal's head down. Flashbacks hit him then, unbidden and violent. The sound of the hail on the hard ground sounded like the crack of rifles. The white bouncing stones looked like bullets kicking up dust. He was back on the border, the smell of gunpowder in his nose, the screams of dying men in his ears. Not now, he gritted out through clenched teeth. Not today. He forced the memory down. He focused on the image of Maggie's face. He focused on Abby's terrified eyes. He was not fighting a war for land or pride today. He was fighting for a little girl who liked peppermint and horses. He leaned low over the horse's neck, shielding his face with his arm, and spurred the animal forward into the white onslaught. He returned 4 hours later. The hail had passed, leaving the ground white and steaming as the sun came back out. Caleb slid off the horse in the ranch yard. He was soaked, shivering, and bruised where the larger stones had hit him. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest. He ran into the foreman's office. Abby was kneeling by the sofa, singing a lullaby in a broken voice. Maggie was still unconscious, her breathing shallow. "I got it," Caleb rasped. He opened the satchel. There were dried leaves, a small bottle of dark amber liquid, and a pouch of powder. "Mrs. Yoder said to boil the leaves," Caleb said, his hands shaking as he laid them out. "Make a steam. And the drops, 3 drops every hour." Abby sobbed with relief. She grabbed the kettle from the stove where she'd kept water warm. They worked together for the next 6 hours. They moved Maggie back to the boarding house attic in a wagon Caleb borrowed, unable to keep her at the rough bunkhouse. In the tiny attic room, the air grew thick with the smell of eucalyptus and sage. Caleb and Abby sat on the floor, shoulder to shoulder. They took turns bathing Maggie's face with cool water. They forced the bitter tea between her lips drop by drop. Outside, the sun set, turning the sky blood red. Inside, the battle raged. Around midnight, Maggie's breathing changed. The hitching rasp smoothed out. She took a deep, shuddering breath and let it out in a long sigh. Sweat broke out on her forehead. Cool sweat, not the dry heat of the fever. "The fever is breaking," Caleb whispered. He put his hand on her forehead. "She is cooling down." Abby slumped against the bed frame. The adrenaline that had held her upright for 20 hours suddenly vanished, leaving her hollow and trembling. She buried her face in her hands and began to cry. It wasn't the frantic crying of before. It was the deep, racking sobs of exhaustion. Caleb shifted. He put his arm around her. It wasn't a tentative gesture this time. He pulled her against his chest, tucking her head under his chin. Abby turned into him. She grabbed the front of his shirt, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. "I thought I lost her." She wept into his shirt. "I thought I lost her." "Caleb." "You did not," Caleb said, his voice rumbling in his chest. "She is a fighter, like her mother." Abby pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears and dust. "They always try to take her," she whispered. "In Ohio, in St. Louis, every town I stop in. They look at me, and they see dirt. They look at her, and they see a mistake. They tell me I am selfish for keeping her. They say a child needs a father, a home, a name." She choked on a sob. "I would die in a ditch before I gave her up. Does that make me selfish? Caleb, does that make me a bad mother?" Caleb looked at her. He reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "It makes you the only good thing I have ever seen," he said fiercely. He looked at the sleeping child, then back at Abby. The people who want to take her, they are the lost ones. Abby, they have empty hearts, so they try to fill them by stealing from others. You are full. You have enough love in you to burn this whole town down. Abby stared at him. The intensity in his gray eyes took her breath away. In the dim candlelight, with the smell of sickness and herbs fading, something shifted. The fear of the fever was gone, replaced by a different kind of tension, a magnetic pull that was undeniable. Abby leaned forward. Caleb did not pull away. His arm tightened around her waist. She rested her forehead against his shoulder. He turned his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of her. They sat there, wrapped in each other, their hearts beating in a syncopated rhythm. It felt terrifyingly right. It felt like coming home after a long, cold war. "Caleb," Abby whispered, "I do not know what I would do without you. You will never have to find out." Caleb answered. He wanted to kiss her. God, he wanted to kiss her. He wanted to lay her down on the rug and promise her that no one would ever hurt her again. His heart pounded with a protective desire so fierce it made his hands shake. But he didn't. He held her. He let the warmth of his body seep into hers, a silent vow that spoke louder than any sermon. The next morning, the crisis had passed. Maggie was weak, sitting up in bed and asking for toast. Abby went downstairs to return the bowl to the kitchen. Mrs. Briggs was there, kneading dough. She looked at Abby's disheveled hair and the dark circles under her eyes. "How is the child?" Hattie asked, her voice less sharp than usual. "Better," Abby said. "The fever broke in the night." Hattie nodded. She glanced toward the stairs. "That cowboy. He stayed the night? He helped me nurse her," Abby said defensively. "Nothing happened, Mrs. Briggs. He saved her life." Hattie sighed. She dusted flour off her hands. "I saw him carry her in. I saw the way he looked at you." "Abigail." She leaned against the counter. "He is a good man. I think, despite the scar, despite the stories." "He is," Abby said softly. "It is a shame," Hattie murmured, looking out the window. "If you were a married woman, if you had a ring on your finger, the town could not say much. A husband covers a multitude of sins in the eyes of the church." She looked back at Abby. "But you are not married, and the first of the month is coming. Abigail, I cannot change the rules just because the child was sick." "You still have to go." Abby nodded, the old weight returning to her shoulders. "I know." She walked back upstairs, Hattie's words echoing in her mind. A husband covers a multitude of sins. When she entered the attic, Caleb was sitting on the floor, carving a small piece of wood with his pocket knife. He was making a whistle for Maggie. He looked up when Abby entered. He saw the shadow on her face. "What did she say?" Caleb asked. "She said I still have to leave on Monday," Abby said, sitting on the bed. Caleb stopped carving. He closed the knife with a sharp click. He looked at Abby. He looked at Maggie. The thought that had been lurking in the back of his mind for weeks suddenly stepped into the light. It was a crazy thought. It was a dangerous thought. He was a broken-down cowboy with nothing to offer but a bad reputation and a strong back. But he looked at them, and he knew he could not let them go. He could not watch them walk out of town and into the unknown. He stood up. He put the whistle in his pocket. "We will figure it out," he said that afternoon, in the back room of the general store. Victor Hale poured a drink for Reverend Trent. "The woman is still here," Victor said, his lips swollen and purple where Caleb had hit him, "and the cowboy is still sniffing around her. He was there all night." Trent frowned, sipping the brandy. "It is a moral outrage. They are flaunting their sin in the face of the congregation. We need to do something drastic." "Reverend," Victor said, leaning forward, "the town is wavering. Some people are starting to feel sorry for her because of the sick kid. If we do not act soon, the rot will set in." "What do you propose?" Trent asked. Victor smiled, a painful stretching of his bruised mouth. "We push them. We push them until they break, and we make sure that when they fall, they never get up again." The fever retreated from Maggie's small body like a tide going out. leaving her weak but cool to the touch. By Wednesday, she was sitting up in the narrow attic bed, demanding more toast and asking why she could not go outside to see the horses. Abby fed her crusts dipped in broth, her heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it hurt to breathe. But outside the sanctuary of the attic, the world had not softened. If anything, the air in Red Rock Crossing had grown poisonous. Abby returned to her scrubbing on Thursday morning. Her knees hit the floorboards of the parlor with a dull thud. As she worked the brush in circles, she could feel the weight of the calendar pressing down on her neck. It was the 26th of the month. She had 4 days left before Hattie's deadline expired. Hattie herself was a nervous ghost, flitting through the hallways, avoiding Abby's gaze. She had stopped scolding about missed spots or wasted soap. Instead, she offered a silence that was far more terrifying. It was the silence of a woman who had already made up her mind and was simply waiting for the executioner to arrive. The town, emboldened by Reverend Trent's Sunday sermon, had decided that silence was no longer enough. They wanted action. Victor Hale was the architect of their outrage. He sat in his saloon, his lips still swollen and purple from Caleb's fist, and spun a web of lies that spread faster than a prairie fire. He told men at the bar that Caleb Ward had not just nursed a sick child that night in the attic. He claimed, with a knowing wink, that he had seen Caleb leaving at dawn, buttoning his shirt. "He is living in sin with her right under the widow's nose," Victor sneered, "pouring whiskey for a nodding rancher. And that little girl, she is just the first, mark my words. In 6 months, Mrs. Cole will be swelling with another bastard." The rumor took root in the dry, bored minds of the townspeople. It confirmed their worst suspicions. It transformed Abby from a pitiable charity case into a dangerous temptress who was corrupting the few good men left in the territory. On Friday afternoon, the sheriff, Miller, knocked on the front door of the boarding house. Abby was polishing the banister. When she saw the sheriff's silhouette through the frosted glass, her rag froze in mid-stroke. Hattie answered the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her face pale. "Sheriff," Hattie said, her voice tight. "Is there trouble? I need to speak with Mrs. Cole." "Hattie," Miller said. He took off his hat, turning the brim in his hands. "It is an official matter." Abby walked down the stairs slowly. Her legs felt heavy, as if she were wading through deep water. She stopped on the bottom step, clutching the newel post. "Sheriff Miller," she said. Miller looked at her. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a weak one. He preferred the path of least resistance, and right now, the current of the town was pushing him hard against Abby. "Mrs. Cole," Miller said, clearing his throat. "I have received some complaints." "Complaints?" Abby asked. "I have not left this house in 3 days." "Sheriff, concerns." "Then," Miller corrected himself, "regarding the welfare of your daughter." Abby went cold. "What about my daughter?" "There is talk," Miller said, looking at the floor. "Talk that this environment, the instability, the lack of a father figure, is not suitable for a child of tender years. Mr. Hale and Reverend Trent have expressed worry that the girl is being raised in moral jeopardy." "Moral jeopardy," Abby repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Because she was sick? Because of your situation?" Miller said, his voice hardening slightly. "Look, Mrs. Cole, I'm trying to help you. If the town council decides you are unfit, they can petition the circuit judge to have the child removed, for her own protection." Abby felt a roar in her ears. Removed. The word was a sterile, legal way of saying stolen. "However," Miller continued, looking miserable, "there is an alternative. The Reverend has contacts at a church home in St. Louis. Very respectable. They train girls for domestic service. If you were to, voluntarily, sign guardianship over to them, it would show the court you have the child's best interests at heart. You could stay here, find work, maybe start fresh." Abby stared at him. The sheer audacity of it took her breath away. They wanted her to cut out her own heart and hand it to them, and they called it mercy. "Get out," she whispered. "Mrs. Cole, please be reasonable. "I said get out," Abby shouted. The scream tore from her throat, startling Hattie, who jumped back against the wall. Abby flew off the bottom step, marching toward the sheriff with a fury that made him take a hasty step backward onto the porch. "You think you can come into my home and tell me how to love my child?" Abby cried, her eyes blazing. "You think because I am poor, I do not bleed? No man who has never gone hungry a day in his life has the right to decide what is best for my daughter." Sheriff Miller held up his hands. "Now, calm down." "I will not calm down." Abby jabbed a finger at his chest. "I nursed her through a fever while this town prayed for me to leave. I worked my fingers to the bone to feed her. You tell Victor Hale and his reverend that if they want my daughter, they will have to kill me first. Do you hear me? They will have to kill me." Miller retreated down the steps, jamming his hat back on his head. "You are making a mistake." "Mrs. Cole," he called back, his voice trying to regain authority. "You are fighting a losing battle. The town will not stand for this much longer." Abby slammed the door. The pane of glass rattled in its frame. She leaned her forehead against the wood, gasping for air, her entire body shaking with the aftershocks of her rage. Behind her, Hattie Briggs stood silent. She did not scold. She looked at Abby's trembling back with a mixture of pity and fear, knowing that defiance, no matter how righteous, rarely paid the rent in Red Rock Crossing. News of the sheriff's visit reached the Bar T Ranch before sunset. Gossip in the West traveled faster than a telegraph, carried on the wind and the loose tongues of ranch hands. Caleb was in the corral, breaking a young colt. The horse was bucking and twisting, kicking up clouds of dust. But Caleb sat the saddle with grim determination. He needed the violence of the ride. He needed something to fight that he could actually defeat. When he dismounted, sweating and dusted with grit, Silas was waiting for him by the fence. The foreman chewed on a matchstick, his expression sour. "Sheriff went to see her today," Silas said without preamble. Caleb froze, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "What happened?" "Threatened to take the kid, Silas said. Said the town is calling her unfit. Hale is pushing for it." Caleb threw his hat into the dirt. A curse exploded from his lips, harsh and guttural. He turned and kicked the fence post, the wood splintering under his boot heel. "He is not going to stop," Caleb snarled. "He is going to keep pushing until she is destroyed. And you are going to get caught in the wreck," Silas warned. "The boss was here an hour ago. Caleb, he was asking about you, asking if you are the one stirring up trouble with the council. What did you tell him?" "I told him you are a good hand," Silas said. "But he was clear. If there is more trouble, if you get arrested, or if this feud with Hale hurts the ranch's business, you are done. We cannot keep a man the whole town is turned against." Caleb looked at the foreman. He knew Silas liked him. He knew this was a warning given out of respect. "It is just a job." "Silas," Caleb said quietly, "it is the only job you have got." Silas shot back, "And winter is coming. You want to be drifting when the snow flies? You want to be sleeping under a bridge because you tried to save a woman who is already sinking?" Caleb did not answer. He picked up his hat, dusted it off, and walked toward the bunkhouse. That night, he did not sleep in his bunk. The air inside felt too close, too full of the snoring of men who slept the sleep of the unburdened. Caleb took his bedroll and walked out to a ridge overlooking the valley. He lay down in the tall grass, staring up at the vast, indifferent canopy of stars. The Milky Way was a smear of white dust across the blackness. The wind moaned through the ravines, a lonely, hollow sound that had always been the soundtrack of his life. He was at a crossroads. He knew it with the certainty of a man reading a map. One road led back to the safety he had carefully constructed. It was a lonely road. Yes, it meant silence. It meant hard work and no one to answer to. It meant he would never have to explain the scars on his soul to anyone. He could drift, work, age, and die, leaving no mark on the world but a few fence posts. The other road led to Abby. That road was terrified him. It was full of noise and judgment. It meant fighting men like Victor Hale. It meant standing up in a church and letting people look at him. It meant being responsible for a fragile little life like Maggie's. But as he lay there, listening to the coyotes yip in the distance. He remembered the way Abby had looked at him in the attic. He remembered the weight of Maggie's sleeping head on his shoulder. He realized that the loneliness he had called safety was actually a slow suffocation. He had been dying for years, inch by inch. Abby had made him breathe again. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of rain from the north. Caleb sat up. He looked toward the dim lights of the town in the distance. "I am not drifting anymore," he whispered to the dark. On Saturday morning, notices were posted on the church door, the general store, and the saloon. Special town meeting Sunday. 1 p.m. topic: the moral preservation of Red Rock Crossing. There was no name mentioned, but everyone knew who the meeting was about. It was a trial, pure and simple. A trial without a judge, where the verdict had been written before the opening arguments. Reverend Trent stood on the church steps, greeting people as they stopped to read the notice. "We must be vigilant," he told them. "We must prune the dead branches so the tree may thrive." The atmosphere in town grew taut. People spoke in hushed tones. They looked at the boarding house with morbid curiosity, waiting to see if the sinner would dare to show her face. Abby did not hide. She washed the windows. She swept the porch. She moved with a rigid, brittle dignity. When Hattie suggested she might want to stay in her room on Sunday, Abby shook her head. "If they are going to judge me, Mrs. Briggs, they can do it to my face." Sunday dawned with a hard, pale blue sky. The heat returned with a vengeance, baking the mud of the previous week into concrete. At 12:30, the bell began to toll. It sounded like a funeral dirge. Abby dressed Maggie in her best dress, the one with the blue sash, which Abby had stayed up late washing and pressing. She dressed herself in her gray Sunday gown. It was worn at the cuffs and faded from washing, but she buttoned it to her chin. She pinned her hair back severely. She knelt in front of Maggie. "Now listen to me," she said, smoothing Maggie's collar. "We are going to the church. People might be loud. They might look at us. But you are not to be afraid. You hold my hand, and you keep your head up. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama," Maggie whispered, her eyes wide. "Is Mr. Caleb coming?" Abby's heart gave a painful lurch. "I do not know. Baby, I do not know." She stood up, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The walk to the church was a gauntlet. The street was lined with wagons and horses. People were filing into the white building, men in dark suits, women in bonnets. As Abby approached, conversation died. The crowd parted, leaving a wide berth around her, as if her poverty and shame were contagious diseases. She kept her eyes fixed on the steeple. She gripped Maggie's hand so tight her knuckles were white. "Just keep walking. Just keep walking." Caleb was pacing near the hitching rail on the far side of the street. He was wearing his best shirt, a clean white one that seemed to glow against his tanned skin, and a black vest. He had polished his boots. He saw Abby walking alone. He saw the way her chin trembled even as she held it high. He saw the terror in her eyes that she was fighting to hide from her daughter. Silas's warning echoed in his head. "You will be done. You will be drifting." Caleb looked at the crowd. He looked at the sneering face of Victor Hale, who was standing by the church doors, welcoming people like a lord of the manor. Caleb stopped pacing. He adjusted his gun belt. He took a breath that filled his lungs with the hot, dusty air of the place he had tried to call home. He walked across the street. He did not run. He walked with the heavy, measured stride of a man walking into a fire. He reached the church steps just as Abby was entering the vestibule. He didn't speak to her. He didn't want to draw fire to her yet. He simply fell in behind her, a silent shadow, and followed her into the sanctuary. The church was stifling. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, lavender water, and self-righteousness. Every pew was full. People were standing in the back. Abby walked down the center aisle. There were no empty seats in the back. She had to walk all the way to the third row before she found a space. As she sat, the people on either side of her shifted away, creating a gap of isolation. Caleb did not sit. He walked halfway down the aisle and stopped. He stood near a support pillar, removing his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him, his feet planted wide. He looked at the altar, his face a mask of stone. A ripple of whispering went through the room. The cowboy. He came. Look at him. Reverend Trent ascended the pulpit. He waited for the murmurs to die down. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "We are gathered here today for a grave purpose," Trent began, his voice booming. "We are a community built on faith, built on order, but there is a rot in our foundation." He picked up a piece of paper. "The letter. I hold here a testimony from the elders of a church in Ohio," Trent said, waving the paper. "They speak of a woman named Abigail Cole. They speak of a woman who birthed a child out of wedlock, who refused to name the father, and who fled her penance to come here and live among decent folk." He looked down at Abby. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale as milk. Victor Hale stood up from the front pew. He turned to face the congregation. "It is not just the past." Victor shouted, "It is the present. This woman has been offered charity. She has been offered honest work. And how does she repay us? With violence. She assaulted me in the boarding house when I tried to help her. She spreads lies. She manipulates men, good men, turning them against their neighbors." Victor pointed a finger at Abby. "She is a danger to every family man in this room. She uses that child as a shield, but she is nothing but a predator." The crowd rumbled. Anger was rising, fed by the heat and the rhetoric. "Stand up, woman," someone shouted from the back. "Answer for yourself." Abby stood. Her legs felt like water, but she forced them to hold her. She turned to face the room. She did not look at Victor. She looked at the faces of the women who had whispered about her, the men who had leered at her. "It is true," she said. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear. "I was not married when I had Maggie. Her father left me." "Shame," a woman cried. "I have shame." Abby said, her voice rising. "I have carried it for 6 years. I have carried it across 3 states. But my daughter is not a sin. She is a child." She looked at the Reverend. "You talk about God's will. Was it God's will that she almost died of fever 3 nights ago because I could not afford a doctor? Was it God's will that Mr. Hale offered to pay my rent only if I warmed his bed?" Gasps filled the room. Victor turned purple. "She lies! She is a liar! I do not lie!" Abby cried, tears finally spilling over. "I have done nothing but work. I scrub your floors. I wash your clothes. And all I ask is to be left alone to raise my child. But you want to take her. You want to tear her away from the only person in the world who loves her. That is the only sin I see here today." She sat down, trembling violently. Maggie buried her face in Abby's skirt, sobbing. For a moment, there was silence. Some faces in the crowd softened. They saw a terrified mother, not a monster. But Reverend Trent was losing control of the narrative. He slammed his hand on the pulpit. "Enough!" Her hysterical outburst changed nothing. "The facts remain. She is destitute. She is of low moral character. For the good of the child and the town, she must go. I propose," Trent said loudly, "that we take up a collection to buy Mrs. Cole a ticket on the next stagecoach, alone. The child will be placed in the custody of the church until a suitable home is found. It is the most merciful course." A few men nodded. "Yes, send her away. Keep the child." It felt inevitable. The weight of the town was crushing her. Abby closed her eyes, clutching Maggie's hand, waiting for the end. Then a sound cut through the heat, the heavy, distinct thud-clack of boot heels on wood. Caleb Ward stepped away from the pillar. He walked into the center of the aisle. He did not look at the preacher. He looked at the crowd. Wait. The word was not shouted. It was spoken in a voice like grinding gravel, but it carried to the rafters. Everyone turned. Caleb stood tall, his hat in his hands, his scar stark white in the filtered sunlight. "You talk about mercy," Caleb said, looking at Trent. "You talk about worth." He turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the men in the pews. "I know about worth. I spent 5 years in the border wars. I saw men who could quote scripture while they burned farms. I saw men who claimed to be righteous while they shot boys in the back." He pointed a hand at Abby. "This woman, she has more courage in her little finger than this whole room has in its spine." "You judge her?" Caleb asked, his voice rising. You judge her for fighting to keep her kin alive? In a land this hard? That is not sin, that is survival. He looked at Victor Hale. You say no man wants her. You say she is broken. Caleb walked down the aisle until he was standing at the end of Abby's pew. He stopped. He looked down at her. Abby looked up, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She saw his hands trembling slightly. She saw the raw, naked vulnerability in his face that he had never shown anyone. I have plenty of sins of my own, Caleb said to the room. But his eyes never left Abby. I have killed men. I have wasted years wishing I was dead. I thought I was too damaged to ever build anything. He took a deep breath. But I look at her, and I want to build something. He turned fully to Abby. He dropped to one knee on the dusty floorboards. The church gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the room. Abby, Caleb said softly. Abby's hands flew to her mouth. The tears were blinding her now. They say no man wants a woman with a child, Caleb said, his voice shaking just a little. Well, they are wrong, because I want you. He reached out and took her free hand. I want you, and I want Maggie. I want to be the one who brings the wood in. I want to be the one who chases the wolves away. I love you, Abigail. He squeezed her hand. Will you marry me? Right here, in front of God and all these people who said you were nothing? The silence was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear the buzzing of the flies. Abby stared at him. She looked at the scar that frightened so many people, and she saw only beauty. She saw a man who had walked into the fire for her. She stood up slowly. She pulled Maggie up with her. Maggie looked at Caleb, wiping her eyes. Yes, Abby whispered. Caleb didn't hear her. He looked terrified. Yes, Abby said louder, her voice breaking into a sob of joy. Yes, Caleb, I will marry you. Caleb let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He stood up and pulled her into his arms. He didn't care about the preacher. He didn't care about the crowd. He buried his face in her neck, holding her as if he would never let go. The church erupted. It wasn't applause. It was a cacophony of shock. Women whispered furiously behind fans. Men stared with their mouths open. He asked her, in front of everyone, the cowboy and the outcast. Victor Hale's face turned a mottled shade of red. He stormed into the aisle. This is a farce, Victor shouted, pointing at them. You cannot allow this. Reverend, that man is a drifter, a killer. He is unfit to be a father. Caleb turned. He still had his arm around Abby. He looked at Victor, and the look on his face stopped Victor in his tracks. The past is done. Victor, Caleb said. His voice was calm now, dangerous and cold. She is not Abby Cole anymore. She is going to be my wife, and if you say one more word about her, or my daughter, you will answer to me. Victor looked around for support, but the townspeople were wavering. They loved a scandal, but they loved a romance more. And what they had just seen, a man claiming a woman when the whole world was against her, had struck a chord in even the hardest hearts. Sheriff Miller stepped forward from the back. If they want to marry, Victor, Miller said, hitching up his belt. There is no law against it, but he is a... Victor sputtered. He is a citizen. Miller said, and if the Reverend won't marry them, I reckon the justice of the peace will... Victor looked at the faces around him. He saw he had lost the room. He saw the way Caleb stood, like a wall between the town and the woman. You will regret this, Victor hissed at Caleb. You think this makes you safe? You just painted a target on your back. Cowboy. He turned and shoved his way out of the church, the doors banging shut behind him. The threat hung in the air, sharp and heavy. But Caleb didn't look at the door. He looked down at Abby, and then at Maggie. He reached out and ruffled Maggie's hair. Let's go home, he said. Abby nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, let's go home. The wedding took place 3 days later, under a sky so blue it looked like painted porcelain. There was no church, for the doors of the sanctuary remained barred to them by the Reverend's indignation. Instead, they stood beneath the twisting skeletal branches of a lone cottonwood tree that grew by the creek bed a mile outside of town. It was a spot where the prairie stretched out in an endless, undulating ocean of brown grass. meeting the horizon in a shimmering line of heat. A traveling Methodist circuit rider named Reverend Thomas, a dusty man with a kind face and boots worn thin by miles of walking, agreed to perform the service. He asked no questions about lineage or reputation. He simply looked at the way Caleb stood between the woman and the wind. And he opened his book. The gathering was small. Silas, the foreman from the Bar T, stood as a witness, holding his hat in his hands and looking uncomfortable but determined. Hattie Briggs had come too, driven by a complex mixture of guilt and a grudging respect for Abby's resilience. She stood a little apart, her hands clasped tight over her purse. And there was Maggie, wearing her blue sash, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the ditch. Abby wore her gray Sunday dress, but she had pinned a sprig of sagebrush to her collar. The wind tugged at her skirts and whipped strands of hair across her face. She did not feel the shame the town had tried to drape over her. As she looked up at Caleb, she felt only a terrifying, breathless hope. Caleb wore his clean white shirt and a black string tie that looked strange against his tanned neck. His hands, usually so steady with a rope or a gun, were trembling slightly. "Do you, Caleb Ward, take this woman?" Reverend Thomas asked, his voice nearly lost in the vastness of the open range. "I do," Caleb said. The words were rough, like stones tumbling in a riverbed, but they were solid. "And do you, Abigail Cole, take this man?" Abby looked at the scar on Caleb's cheek. She looked at the gray eyes that had seen war and death and yet had still softened for her daughter. "I do," she whispered. There were no rings. Caleb had no gold to give. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small silver locket he had traded his best spurs for the day before. He placed it in Abby's hand. "With this, I pledge you my life," Caleb said softly, "and I pledge you a home." When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Caleb leaned down. He did not grab her. He waited, letting her close the distance. When their lips met, it was not the desperate, frantic collision of the stable. It was a sealing. It was a promise made in blood and breath. It tasted of dust and sage, and a future that suddenly seemed possible. Maggie cheered, throwing her flowers into the air. Caleb broke the kiss, scooped the child up into his arms, and for the first time since he had arrived in Red Rock Crossing, he laughed aloud. The honeymoon was a 12-mile wagon ride to a line shack on the northern edge of the Bar T range. The shack was little more than a wooden box with a tin roof, sitting on a rise overlooking a bend in the creek. It had been abandoned for 2 years. The windows were shuttered with warped planks. The door hung on one hinge, and the inside smelled of rats and damp earth. To anyone else, it would have looked like a hovel. To Abby, it looked like a castle. They spent the first week working until their muscles screamed. Caleb convinced his boss to let them live there in exchange for Caleb watching the northern herd, a job that usually required a man to live alone in isolation. They patched the roof with flattened tin cans and tar. They scrubbed the walls with lye until the wood bleached white. They built a corral from cedar posts Caleb cut himself, dragging the timber down from the hills. Every nail Caleb hammered felt like a defiance. Clang. That was for Victor Hale. Clang. That was for the Reverend. Clang. That was for every man who had looked at Abby with contempt. He was not just building a shelter. He was staking a claim. He was carving a space out of the hostile world where his family could breathe. At night, the wind howled around the shack, testing the walls, but the walls held. Their first night alone, after the work was done, was a night Abby would remember for the rest of her life. They had hung a quilt to partition off a small corner for Maggie's bed. The child, exhausted from chasing lizards and helping carry water, fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow. Abby and Caleb sat at the small table Caleb had built. A kerosene lamp flickered between them, casting long, dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. The silence of the prairie pressed against the door. But inside, there was warmth. Caleb looked at her across the table. He looked at her hands, red from scrubbing, resting on the rough wood. He reached out and covered them with his own. "Are you sorry?" he asked quietly. It is a hard life. Abby, it is not what you were raised for. Abby turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. I was raised to be ornamental. Caleb, I was raised to be perfect. And when I broke, they threw me away. She looked him in the eye. I am not sorry. I have never been less sorry for anything. Caleb stood up. He blew out the lamp. He led her to the bed in the corner of the main room, a mattress filled with fresh prairie grass and covered with clean linens. In the dark, the wind outside seemed to vanish. There was only the sound of their breathing and the rustle of clothes. When Caleb touched her, his hands shook, not from fear, and not from the violence that had lived in them for so long. They shook from a reverence that made Abby's throat tight. He touched her as if she were made of glass, as if he were terrified he might shatter her. You are beautiful, he whispered into the dark. Abby felt the tears prick her eyes. She had been called a sinner. She had been called used goods. She had been looked at with lust and with disgust, but she had never felt cherished. I am yours, she whispered back. Their lovemaking was slow, a quiet storm of discovery. It was an undoing of all the hurt they had both carried. With every touch, Caleb erased the memory of the men who had looked at her with scorn. With every kiss, Abby drew the poison of the war out of his blood. When they finally lay still, limbs tangled together under the heavy wool blanket, Caleb buried his face in her hair. Thank you, he breathed. For what? Abby asked sleepily. For seeing me, he said. Happiness in the West was a fragile thing, something to be guarded with a loaded rifle. Victor Hale did not take his defeat lightly. The marriage had humiliated him. He had lost face in front of the town he believed he owned, and his vanity was a wound that refused to heal. He could not attack them openly, not with the sheriff watching and the town's sympathy slowly shifting. So he attacked them in the dark. It started with rumors. Victor told the Cattlemen's Association that Caleb was stealing strays. He hinted that the Bartees northern herd was light on the count because Caleb was running a side business selling beef to the reservation. Then, the sabotage began. Caleb would ride out in the morning to find a mile of fence cut, the wire coiled and hidden. He would find a waterhole poisoned with a dead coyote thrown into the center. He worked twice as hard to fix the damage, riding until he was reeling with exhaustion, determined not to give his boss a reason to fire him. One evening in October, Sheriff Miller rode out to the shack. He looked unhappy. I have to look in the ravine. Caleb, Miller said, not meeting his eyes. Hale says he has a witness who saw you driving a branded calf down there. There is nothing in the ravine but rocks and rattlesnakes, Caleb said. His jaw tight. Miller rode down. 10 minutes later, he came back up, dragging a calf with a rope. The calf bore Victor Hale's brand. It had been tied to a mesquite bush, hidden deep in the brush. Someone put that there, Caleb said, his voice rising. You know I did not steal a calf. Miller, I have been fixing fence all day. Miller sighed, wiping his face. I know it looks like a setup, Caleb, but the law is the law. I have to file a report. If the judge sees this, it is hanging offense territory. I did not take it. I believe you, son, but you need to come into town tomorrow and make a statement. You need to fight this on paper. If you do not, Hale will have a warrant sworn out by noon. The next day, the sky was a sheet of iron gray. The wind was picking up, smelling of winter. Caleb kissed Abby goodbye at the door. I will be back before dark. He promised. I will make the sheriff listen. I will make the boss understand. Be careful, Abby said, gripping his coat. Victor is desperate. He is a coward, Caleb said grimly. And cowards make mistakes. He rode out, leaving Abby and Maggie alone at the shack. The day passed slowly. The wind rose to a howl, rattling the tin roof. As evening approached, the darkness fell heavy and absolute. Abby was cooking a stew on the cast-iron stove when she heard the horses. She wiped her hands and went to the window. She expected to see Caleb. Instead, she saw 3 shadowy figures riding up the rise. They carried torches. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She grabbed the rifle from above the door, but her hands were shaking. Maggie," she said, her voice tight. "Get under the bed. Now." The riders stopped in the yard. One of them was Victor Hale. Even in the gloom, she recognized his heavy coat and the way he sat his horse. "Mrs. Cole!" Victor shouted over the wind. "We have come for the child." Abby cracked the door open, leveling the rifle. "Get off my land." "Victor, your land?" Victor laughed. "This is a thief's den. We are here to rescue that little girl from a criminal." He signaled to the men, "Burn it out." One of the hired men threw his torch. It landed on the roof of the small barn, where the winter hay was stored. The dry grass caught instantly. Whoosh! The flames leaped up, orange and hungry against the black sky. "No!" Abby screamed. The fire roared, catching the wind. Sparks flew toward the house. Victor dismounted, limping slightly on his bad leg. He marched toward the door. "You are coming with us, Abigail, and the girl is going to the orphanage where she belongs." Abby didn't think. She opened the door and swung the rifle barrel, aiming for his chest. But before she could pull the trigger, the second man rushed her from the side, knocking the gun from her hands. She fell back, scrambling. She grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace. "Run, Maggie!" "Run to the creek!" Abby screamed. Victor grabbed her arm, trying to drag her out. Abby swung the poker with all her strength. It connected with his shoulder with a dull thud. Victor yelled and backhanded her, sending her crashing into the table. Outside, the barn was an inferno. The heat was searing. Caleb was 2 miles away when he saw the glow. It was a jagged orange scar on the horizon. He stopped his horse, his heart stopping in his chest. Fire! The memory of the border war flashed in his mind. The smell of burning thatch, the screams. But he pushed it down. He crushed it under the heel of his terror for Abby. "Abby!" He screamed into the wind. He spurred the roan. The horse, sensing his desperation, flattened its ears and flew. They tore across the prairie, risking a broken leg in every gopher hole, flying over the scrub. As he crested the rise, the scene below hit him like a physical blow. The barn was gone, consumed by fire. The house was smoking. And in the yard, figures were struggling. Caleb didn't slow down. He drew his colt. He rode into the yard like a demon. He saw Victor dragging Maggie by her arm, while Abby clawed at his face. "Let her go!" Caleb roared. He leaped from the horse while it was still moving. He hit the ground rolling and came up running. Victor saw him. He let go of Maggie and drew his own pistol. Caleb didn't stop. He tackled Victor just as the gun went off. Crack! A line of fire burned across Caleb's shoulder, tearing the coat and skin. But the momentum carried them both into the dirt. Caleb's fist slammed into Victor's face. Once, twice. Victor scrambled back, gasping, reaching for his fallen gun. Caleb kicked it away. He stood over Victor, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his shoulder. He leveled his Colt at Victor's head. "Give me a reason," Caleb whispered. "Give me one reason." Victor froze, staring up at the dark barrel. Behind them, one of the hired men saw the tide turn. He spurred his horse and fled into the night. The other man, the one who had knocked Abby down, stood with his hands raised, looking at Abby, who had regained her rifle. "Don't shoot," the man stammered. "I was just paid to ride." "Get water," Abby yelled at him. "The house is catching." She didn't wait. She grabbed a bucket and ran to the creek. Caleb looked at Victor, then at the fire licking the side of their home. He holstered his gun. He grabbed a shovel. For the next hour, they fought the fire. Caleb, Abby, and the terrified hired man threw dirt and water on the flames. They beat the grass with wet blankets. The barn was lost, but they saved the house. When the last flame was smothered, leaving only smoking ruins and the smell of char, Caleb collapsed on the porch steps. He clutched his bleeding shoulder. Abby was there instantly, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind the wound. Victor tried to crawl away in the confusion. He made it to the edge of the slope, but his bad leg gave out. He tumbled down into the creek bed with a cry of pain, landing awkwardly on the rocks. Sheriff Miller arrived an hour later, followed by Silas and a dozen men from town who had seen the blaze. They found a tableau of judgment. The barn was a skeleton of black timbers. Caleb sat on the porch, pale and bloodied, with Abby's arm around him. The hired man was tied to the fence post. Victor Hale was lying in the mud of the creek bed, moaning, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. "What happened here?" Miller asked, looking at the destruction. "He tried to burn us out," Abby said, her voice shaking with rage. "He tried to take my daughter." Miller looked at the hired man. "Is that true?" The man nodded frantically. "It is true. Sheriff, he said we were rescuing the kid. He told us to light the barn to scare them out. I never wanted to kill nobody." Miller looked down at Victor. He walked down the slope and stood over the wealthy merchant. "You went too far, Victor," Miller said quietly. "Help me," Victor groaned. "These maniacs, they attacked me." Miller shook his head. "I see a burned barn. I see a shot man. And I see a witness. You are done." "Victor." Silas and the ranch hands hauled Victor up. They threw him over a saddle like a sack of feed. Reverend Trent, who had ridden out with the group, stared at the scene. He looked at the family huddled on the porch, the scarred cowboy, the defiant woman, and the child safe between them. He looked at the ashes of their livelihood. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his righteous war had been nothing more than fuel for a rich man's vanity. He took off his hat and lowered his head, unable to meet Abby's eyes. "We are taking him in," Miller said to Caleb. "You need a doctor for that shoulder. I will be fine." Caleb said, "Just take him away." Abby stood up. "Wait." She walked down the steps. She walked up to Victor Hale, who was draped over the horse, pale with pain. "You said no man wanted me," Abby said softly. "You said I was broken." She pointed back at the porch, where Caleb sat watching her with adoration in his eyes. "You were wrong," she said. She turned her back on him and walked up the steps to her husband. Winter came hard that year, but the shack held warm. With Victor in jail awaiting trial in the territory capital, the poison drained out of Red Rock Crossing. It didn't happen overnight. There was no parade. But slowly, the town changed. When Caleb rode into town for supplies, men nodded to him. They asked about his shoulder. They asked about the herd. Abby started baking bread. Thick, crusty loaves made from a sourdough starter she had nurtured. She brought them to the general store, now run by a clerk appointed by the bank. They sold out in hours. Women who had once turned their backs began to stop her. "Mrs. Ward." They would say, "That bread was lovely." "How is the little one?" They didn't apologize. People in the West rarely did. But they bought her bread, and they smiled at Maggie. And that was enough. Caleb's name was cleared of the theft charges. The boss, impressed by Caleb's grit in saving the house and the northern herd from the fire, gave him a raise and the permanent deed to the line shack and 40 acres surrounding it. They were not rich. They worked from dawn until dusk. There were droughts that turned the creek to dust, and blizzards that buried the cattle. There were nights they went to bed with aching backs and worried minds. But they were together. The story ends on an evening in late spring. 2 years later, the barn had been rebuilt, stronger this time, with stone foundations. The air was cool and still, smelling of damp earth and blooming sage. The sky to the west was a masterpiece of orange and violet fire, the sun dipping below the mesas. Maggie was asleep inside. She was 8 now, tall for her age, clutching a wooden horse Caleb had carved for her. Caleb sat on the top step of the porch, whittling a piece of cedar. Abby sat beside him, leaning back against his chest, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist. They watched the stars prick through the darkening sky, one by one. "You know," Caleb said quietly, his voice rumbling against her back. "I used to look at this sky and feel like I was drowning in it. I felt so small, like I did not matter." Abby rested her hand on his forearm, tracing the line of an old scar. "And now?" "Now," Caleb said, "I look at it, and I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be." He tightened his hold on her. "I was a fool. Abby, I thought I was cursed. I thought I was meant to walk alone until I died in the dirt." He kissed the top of her head. But I was the lucky one. All those men, Victor, the preacher, they looked at you and saw nothing. I looked at you and saw my whole life." Abby smiled, tears stinging her eyes. She turned in his arms and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of home. "We saved each other. Caleb," she whispered. They sat there as the night took the prairie. The coyotes began to sing in the distance, but the sound was no longer lonely. It was just the song of the wild, vast world they had conquered. In the darkness, the light from their window spilled out onto the grass, a small, stubborn square of gold against the endless night. It was a fragile light, perhaps, but it burned steady. And on the high plains, where the wind never stopped blowing, a steady light was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for journeying with me to Red Rock Crossing. It has been a privilege to share the story of Abby and Caleb with you. These characters, though fictional, carry the spirit of the thousands of men and women who fought for love and dignity in the harsh American West. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Where are you listening from today? Did Caleb's redemption or Abby's courage speak to you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of grit, romance, and the frontier spirit. Until we meet again on the trail,